I never thought a simple weekend in a cabin could turn into one of the most terrifying experiences of my life. I had been looking forward to it for months. A small, rustic cabin deep in the woods, far from the crowded city. A place where I could unwind and escape from the constant noise of emails, calls, and traffic. It was advertised as isolated, peaceful, and perfect for someone looking to be alone with nature. I imagined mornings filled with the smell of pine and damp earth, the quiet sound of birdsong, and nights lit only by the soft glow of a fireplace and the occasional flicker of stars through the trees. I arrived in the early afternoon, the sun high but already soft with the beginning of fall, casting long shadows through the dense woods. The drive itself had been unnerving in subtle ways. The road narrower than it appeared on the map, winding sharply with no guardrails and thick trees pressing close to either side. I had double-checked my phone for signal, knowing it might be weak, but for the moment, it showed one bar, which gave me a faint sense of reassurance. Parking near the cabin, I noticed how quiet it was. A silence so heavy it almost felt like it could press against you physically. The cabin was made of dark, aged wood, with a steep roof and a small porch that creaked under my weight. Windows were covered in dust and streaks of rain from last week's storm, and the door, a heavy slab of oak, had a lock that looked old but solid. I had brought the key with me, but I still hesitated for a moment, as if stepping inside might somehow trap me. Inside, the cabin smelled of cold wood and mildew, a mixture of dampness from the forest and years of unused space. Dust motes floated in the beams of sunlight that broke through the windows. The interior was sparse but functional. A small kitchen with a stove and sink, a wooden table, a few chairs, and a loft with a bed tucked under the angled roof. There was a fireplace, unused but clean, and I thought about starting a small fire once night fell. I unpacked slowly, trying to convince myself I was here for relaxation, even as a faint unease tickled the back of my mind. The silence felt almost alive. Each creak of the wood beneath my feet, each whisper of wind against the window, sounded sharper than it should have. I spent the first few hours exploring the surroundings. The cabin sat on a slight rise, with the forest sloping downward on all sides. There was a small stream nearby, the sound of running water faint but steady. Birds moved in the trees, but not as many as I had expected. The woods felt strangely empty. Occasionally, I would catch the movement of something in the undergrowth. Quick, low shadows that vanished when I turned to look. But I told myself it was deer, squirrels, or my imagination. Still, the feeling of being watched started to creep in, subtle at first, but growing in intensity as the daylight began to fade. The first night was uneventful, though sleep came slowly. I left the small fire burning, enough to cast shadows across the walls and ceiling. Each crackle of the wood felt startlingly loud, and I realized that even the smallest sounds, the wind tapping against the roof, branches brushing against windows, seemed magnified in the silence. When I finally slept, it was light, dream-filled sleep, and I woke several times to noises that made me hold my breath, listening for any sign of intrusion. The next day, I decided to explore the surrounding forest. A trail led down from the cabin, barely maintained, with roots and fallen branches making footing tricky. I walked for hours, following the stream, climbing over logs, and occasionally pausing to look back at the cabin. Each time I did, it seemed smaller, more vulnerable, almost swallowed by the forest around it. The feeling of unease grew. By the time I returned, the sun was lower, casting long shadows that made the trees seem to lean toward me. That evening, I prepared a simple meal on the stove, eating slowly while listening to the forest grow darker. The air was colder than expected, and I found myself layering blankets around my shoulders even as I sat near the fireplace. Then came the first unmistakable sound of something outside the cabin, a faint thump against the wooden walls. Slow, deliberate. I froze. My first thought was a deer or some other large animal, but the sound repeated, soft but rhythmic, like someone testing the strength of the door. I strained to hear, heart racing, every instinct urging me to leave the cabin immediately, but I forced myself to stay still, rationalizing that it must be an animal. The thumping continued intermittently through the night. I sat awake near the fire, the shadows growing longer and darker, and every time a branch scraped against the cabin, my heart leapt. I kept checking the locks on the doors and windows, but nothing appeared to be wrong. Still, sleep was impossible. My mind kept imagining footsteps moving outside, circling the cabin, hiding in the shadows, waiting. By the third day, I realized the isolation itself had started to get under my skin. The forest seemed to press closer, every sound magnified, every shadow a potential threat. I tried to focus on small tasks, stacking firewood, cleaning, organizing supplies. But even in doing these mundane things, I felt watched. That night, the noises returned, louder, closer. Something was moving around the cabin. I could hear the crunch of leaves under heavy boots, the soft scraping against the walls. Fear gripped me in a way that made every nerve vibrate. I avoided looking out the windows directly, but the sense of being observed was undeniable. I spent the next hours reinforcing the doors and windows, blocking access points as best I could. I realized that if someone was trying to get in, I had limited options. The nearest neighbors were miles away, and my phone signal had dropped to zero. I had to assume that help might not arrive for hours, or even the entire night. Every shadow cast by the firelight seemed to twist into forms that my mind filled in with threatening shapes. By the early hours of the morning, I was exhausted but remained alert, a constant watch over the cabin and its surroundings. The turning point came late on the fourth day. I had gathered extra logs and was about to rest when I noticed footprints outside. Not animal tracks. These were human, large, heavy, and approaching the cabin slowly from the treeline. My stomach sank, but I tried to stay calm. I examined the layout of the cabin, planning how I might escape if necessary. There was a small back window, partially obscured by trees, which might allow me to slip out unnoticed. I gathered what I could carry: a bag with food, a small knife, and my phone, though it still showed no signal. I waited, listening, holding my breath. The footsteps circled closer, stopping periodically, as if whoever it was testing the cabin, listening, smelling, trying to determine if it was empty. The fear was suffocating, but I forced myself to remain quiet, observing. Then I noticed something crucial. The footprints led to the side of the cabin and stopped. I peered through the window, careful to stay hidden. There, partially obscured by shadows, I saw a man. He was alone, carrying a bag. He seemed cautious, as if unsure whether anyone was inside. My heart raced as I realized he was not just passing by. He was looking for something, maybe the cabin itself, maybe anyone inside. I decided that night would be my escape. I waited until he moved further around the cabin, then carefully slipped out the back, keeping low in the shadows. I moved slowly, deliberately, making no noise, keeping the cabin between me and the man. Every step felt dangerous, every snapping twig a potential signal. I followed the terrain, using the trees and underbrush as cover, until I was confident I had put enough distance between us. Only then did I break into a run, heading for the road where my car was parked. By dawn, I reached the car, shaking, exhausted, and drenched in sweat despite the cold. I drove immediately, never looking back, heart still pounding. The roads were still empty, and the forest seemed endless, but eventually, I reached the main highway. I stopped at a gas station, called the police, and reported the incident. They said someone had been trespassing in the area for days, and local hikers had reported a man moving stealthily through the woods. I gave my statement and finally felt a sense of relief, though the images of the cabin and the man circling it lingered. I never returned to that cabin. The experience stayed with me for months. The silence, the feeling of being watched, the pressure of isolation that made every sound terrifying. But it also taught me something essential. Preparation matters, vigilance matters, and instinct matters. I realized I had survived not because of luck, but because I stayed calm, observed carefully, and acted decisively. Even in the most terrifying, isolated circumstances, clarity and action can save you. And for that lesson, I am thankful, though I would never wish to repeat the ordeal. I had been driving all day, the winding forest road stretching endlessly beneath the tires of my old Subaru, its engine grumbling over rocks and potholes that had worn down the asphalt into jagged cracks. The sun was beginning to sink behind the hills, its light muted by a dense layer of clouds that seemed to hover perpetually over this part of the forest. I had planned this cabin trip for months, my own little escape from the noise of the city, from the constant barrage of messages and deadlines that never stopped. I wanted isolation, the kind of isolation that made the quiet almost unbearable at first, but eventually soothing in its steadiness. I had a checklist, printed neatly on a page, and I had followed it meticulously. Food, water, matches, candles, a first aid kit, batteries, lantern, blankets, and a small camping stove. Everything was in the trunk. My backpack rested on the passenger seat, and I kept checking the directions on my phone, even though I knew there would be no signal the moment I left the main road behind. The final turnoff from the main road was marked by a narrow dirt path that disappeared between thick pines and birches, their trunks blackened in places, the bark peeling like old paper. I slowed the car, my tires crunching over loose gravel. There was no one around, no signs of life, no cars passing by, not even a bird making a sound. The forest felt heavy, not threatening exactly, but dense in a way that made the air itself seem like it weighed something. The road twisted and turned, and the trees closed in overhead, their branches forming a canopy that blocked most of the remaining sunlight. I reached the final curve and saw it. A small, weathered cabin, set back a little from the road, half hidden by tall grass and a line of young trees. It was more rustic than I expected, but that was part of why I had chosen it. A place like this, abandoned or nearly so, offered solitude that even the best city hotels never could. The cabin itself was made of logs, rough-hewn and darkened with age. The roof sagged slightly in the middle, and the windows were streaked with dirt. One of the panes cracked in the corner. I parked in front of the rickety wooden porch and stepped out, inhaling the smell of wet wood and pine needles. The air was cool and damp, the kind of cold that seeps into your bones if you stay in it too long. I unlocked the door, which protested with a groan and the scrape of metal. Inside, the cabin was simple. A small living area with a worn couch, a table with chairs, a tiny kitchen with a sink and stove, and a bedroom in the back with a single bed and a pile of blankets. Dust covered most surfaces, and there was a faint smell of mold in the corners. I set my backpack down and began unpacking, carefully placing my supplies on the table and checking my food and water first. I lit the stove and boiled water for coffee, the hiss of the flame echoing strangely in the quiet cabin. The light from the small window illuminated motes of dust floating in the air, moving slowly as if the room itself had slowed time. I drank my coffee slowly, savoring the warmth and the taste, feeling the tension of the road begin to leave my shoulders. Outside, the wind began to pick up, shaking the trees and making a low, constant groan through the trunks. I watched it for a while, noticing the way the shadows moved across the clearing in front of the cabin, shifting with the motion of the branches. Everything was still and quiet, except for the wind, but there was an odd feeling in the air, something I couldn't name. It wasn't fear, exactly, more like an awareness that I was very alone and very small in a vast place. As night fell, I prepared for sleep. I stacked blankets on the bed, laid out my flashlight and lantern, and double-checked that all windows and doors were secure. The darkness came fast, faster than it ever does in the city. Within minutes, the cabin was swallowed in a black so complete that even my hand in front of my face seemed strange and disorienting. I lay in bed, listening to the wind, the occasional rustle of leaves, the creak of the cabin settling. Sleep came slowly, my mind restless with thoughts of isolation. Around midnight, I woke to a noise. At first, I thought it was the wind, something scraping against the side of the cabin. But then it came again, deliberate, slow. A thud against the wall near the back door. I froze, trying to convince myself it was just a branch moving in the wind, but my stomach knotted with unease. Another thud. This one sounded heavier, like something solid. I reached for my flashlight and shined it toward the back door, the beam cutting through the darkness. Nothing, only the shadows of the trees beyond the small window, shifting with the wind. My heart pounded as I strained to hear anything else, but the wind had died down, leaving an oppressive silence in its place. I debated staying in the bed or moving to check the door, finally deciding to stand and listen from the doorway of the kitchen. Every step I took made the floorboards creak beneath me. I approached the back door slowly, my flashlight steady in my hand, scanning the area. There were no footprints, no obvious signs of anyone or anything, just the broken branches and the disturbed leaves near the edge of the porch. I checked the locks, still secure. My rational mind insisted it was an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon. I could almost convince myself of that, but the thud had been too deliberate, too heavy for a small animal. I returned to bed, my nerves frayed. I lay awake the rest of the night, the occasional snap of a branch or groan of the cabin making me startle, my body tense as though ready to run at any sound. The next morning, I tried to shake off the feeling of unease. I made breakfast and cleaned up, the simple routine helping to ground me. I decided to explore the immediate area around the cabin, thinking that maybe seeing more of my surroundings would calm my mind. The clearing around the cabin was overgrown, but there was a narrow path leading into the woods. I followed it for a while, careful with each step, noting the way the sunlight filtered through the trees, the patterns of moss and lichen on the trunks. I found a small stream not far from the cabin, water clear and cold, running over rocks and fallen branches. I knelt and drank a little, washing my hands and face. It was refreshing, grounding, a reminder that I was capable of navigating and surviving in this environment. When I returned to the cabin, I noticed something that made my heart skip. The back door was slightly ajar, though I could have sworn I had locked it the night before. My hands shook as I closed and locked it again, checking the windows. Everything else seemed untouched. I considered leaving immediately, but it was still early, and I had come here to experience solitude, to test my own endurance in the forest. I told myself to stay calm, that the incident was likely nothing, maybe an animal or the wind. But the unease had rooted itself firmly, a weight in my chest that I could not shake. Over the next couple of days, small things kept happening. Objects I had left on the table shifted slightly, though I was certain I had placed them carefully. Footsteps in the dirt outside the cabin appeared, though there were no signs of any person coming or going. I even found scratch marks on the wooden porch near the back door, thin and deep, like claws or perhaps a knife, though I had no explanation for how they got there. My anxiety grew, but I forced myself to remain rational. There was no one around, and I had not seen another human for miles. Maybe the marks were old, maybe the objects had shifted because of the drafty cabin. Still, every night, I found myself lying awake, listening to sounds that seemed louder than they could possibly be, imagining figures just outside the window. It was on the third night that things escalated. I had prepared for sleep and was just drifting off when I heard a loud, deliberate crash outside, followed by a series of thuds, like someone or something was moving around the perimeter of the cabin. I grabbed the flashlight and lantern, my hands trembling. I tried to peer through the windows, but the darkness outside was complete. I considered leaving immediately, but my car was parked a short distance away, down a winding, uneven path. The idea of navigating that road in the dark filled me with dread. I stayed put, barricading the doors with a chair, my mind racing through every possible scenario. Hours passed. The noise returned intermittently, thuds, scraping, the sound of something heavy being dragged across the ground. I remained frozen, holding the flashlight, trying not to make a sound. Morning eventually came, weak and gray, and the forest appeared calm again, almost innocent in its beauty. I dared to step outside, my legs stiff and trembling. I examined the area around the cabin. Footprints circled the cabin but led no further. Disturbed leaves, broken twigs, and the same scratch marks on the porch. I gathered my belongings quickly, packed my car, and left, my heart still racing. The drive back to the main road was tense, every shadow on the side of the path making me jump. It took me nearly an hour to reach the paved road, where I could finally breathe and feel safe again. The relief was overwhelming, a release of tension I had not realized I had been holding. I stopped at a small convenience store, bought water, and sat in the parking lot, letting the normal sounds of civilization, cars, distant voices, a dog barking, soothe my frayed nerves. I never went back to that cabin, and I made a point I had been planning the trip for weeks. I wanted to get away from the city, from the constant noise and pressure, and spend some time alone in the mountains. I found a small cabin for rent in a remote area, far from the main road, surrounded by dense forest. The pictures online made it look cozy, rustic, and peaceful. I packed my bags carefully. Enough food for a week, a first aid kit, water, a sleeping bag, a few books, and a small camping stove. I was careful with every detail because I wanted this to be a safe, quiet retreat, not a rushed getaway. I didn't expect that the peace I sought would turn into one of the most terrifying weeks of my life. The drive to the cabin took longer than I thought. The roads were narrow and winding, and after a few hours, the paved roads ended, replaced by dirt paths full of potholes and loose stones. My car struggled in places, and I had to slow down to avoid hitting rocks. Trees crowded the sides of the road, branches sometimes scraping the car, making me feel more isolated with every mile. The GPS signal disappeared long before I reached the cabin, leaving me completely on my own with only the map I printed at home. The silence in the forest was so heavy it almost felt alive. Birds chirped faintly, and somewhere far off, I heard the occasional snap of a branch, but nothing else moved. When I finally reached the cabin, I realized how truly remote it was. It was a single-story wooden structure, surrounded by thick woods on all sides. A small clearing around the cabin allowed for a bit of sunlight, but even that was dim with the trees so tall. The air smelled sharp, like wet pine and moss. I parked the car on the small dirt patch outside and looked at the cabin carefully. It was in decent condition, with the windows intact and the wooden walls solid. The porch creaked under my weight as I stepped inside. Dust covered most surfaces, but it looked like it had been cleaned recently enough for someone to stay comfortably. The furniture was minimal. A small kitchen table, a couple of chairs, a bed, and a tiny stove. The cabin had no electricity, no running water, but there was a well outside and a wood-burning stove inside, which would be enough. I felt a thrill of satisfaction. This was exactly what I needed. I spent the first day exploring the immediate area, familiarizing myself with the surroundings. There was a narrow path leading further into the woods, which I marked mentally for potential hikes. I gathered firewood near the cabin, making sure to have enough for at least a week. By evening, the air grew cold quickly, and I lit the stove. The warm glow and the smell of burning wood gave me comfort. I cooked a simple meal and settled into the bed, feeling completely alone but in a way that was refreshing. I had never spent this much time alone in my life, and part of me loved it. The quiet allowed me to notice small things. The way shadows moved with the flicker of the stove, the occasional wind rustling through the trees, the smell of damp earth. It was like the forest itself was breathing around me. The next day, I decided to go for a longer hike. I packed a small bag with water, snacks, a knife, and a flashlight, just in case. The trail started easy, just a narrow dirt path through the forest, but soon it became rougher. I had to step over fallen branches, avoid muddy patches, and climb small rocky inclines. The deeper I went, the darker it became, even though it was midday. The trees were tall and thick, and the forest floor was covered in ferns and moss. Occasionally, I spotted animal tracks, deer, raccoons, maybe a fox. There was something reassuring about seeing that wildlife existed in this area, something primal that reminded me I was part of a bigger world, even if just for a moment. I walked for hours, taking care to note landmarks, and eventually decided to head back before it became too late. The path seemed different on the way back, longer and more twisting, but I trusted my memory. I reached the cabin just as the sun dipped low, casting long shadows that made the forest look even more imposing. That night, while I was cooking, I thought I heard something moving outside. At first, I ignored it, thinking it was just the wind or an animal. But then the sound came again, louder this time. A crunch of leaves and a low, dragging noise. I froze. The cabin was small, and I could hear every sound clearly. My heart started to race, but I reminded myself that this was the forest, and wild animals were normal here. I checked my knife, set it beside the bed, and tried to calm myself. Nothing happened after that, but I couldn't sleep well. Every small noise, the crack of a branch, a thump in the distance, made me tense. I kept imagining shapes outside the window, shadows moving just beyond my vision. The following day, I noticed something strange when I went to fetch water from the well. There were footprints around the clearing, not mine, not any animal tracks I recognized. They were deep, heavy, like someone had been wearing boots. My stomach sank. I had been careful to lock the cabin door, but the footprints seemed fresh. They led from the edge of the trees toward the cabin and back into the forest. I felt exposed, vulnerable. The isolation I had loved suddenly felt dangerous. I spent hours examining the perimeter, making sure nothing else had been disturbed. There was no sign of anyone inside, but the thought lingered. Someone had been nearby, watching, or passing through. I decided not to leave the cabin for the next couple of days. I stayed inside, kept the stove going, and kept the knife within reach. I tried to distract myself by cleaning, organizing, and reading, but the tension never left. At night, every noise seemed amplified. The wind shaking the trees, branches scratching against the roof, small animals scuttling near the walls. My imagination ran wild, thinking of all the worst-case scenarios. Someone hiding in the woods, waiting for me to venture out, maybe trying to steal supplies or worse. On the fourth night, it happened. I was asleep when I felt the bed shift slightly, a heavy vibration that was unmistakably human. I froze instantly, trying to process what was happening. The door to the cabin had not been locked from the inside, but I had closed it carefully. Whoever it was had entered quietly. I held my breath, listening. There was a soft, deliberate sound, footsteps moving across the wooden floor. My heart pounded so loudly I was afraid it would give me away. I clutched my knife, trying to steady my trembling hands. Then I realized something crucial. The intruder was slow, methodical, almost as if they were looking for something. I stayed absolutely still, barely breathing, and waited. After what felt like hours, the sound stopped. I didn't move. Finally, I crept to the door and looked outside. The clearing was empty. My first thought was relief, but then I saw it. Footprints leading away from the cabin, deep and heavy, leaving the clearing and disappearing into the dense forest. I understood then that the person had been inside while I slept, but they had left before taking anything, leaving me shaken, terrified, but unharmed. The next day, I decided it was too dangerous to stay. I packed quickly, taking only essentials, and prepared to leave. I had learned a lot in those few days. How isolated I was, how vulnerable the forest could make me, and how careful one had to be in remote places. The hike back to the main road was tense. Every shadow, every sound, every rustle of leaves made me jump. I constantly checked behind me, even though I hoped no one was following. By the time I reached the car, I was exhausted, my nerves raw, my body tense. Driving back on the dirt roads, I felt a mix of relief and lingering fear. The city lights in the distance were comforting, a reminder that I was returning to safety. I had planned a peaceful retreat, but I had encountered something raw, unpredictable, and real. That week in the cabin had been the most intense, terrifying, and eye-opening experience of my life. I realized that isolation, while peaceful in theory, could become dangerous very quickly, and that even the smallest signs, footprints, broken branches, subtle sounds, could not be ignored. By the time I reached home, I felt a deep sense of gratitude for safety, familiarity, and human connection. I never returned to that cabin. I sold the rental rights and avoided the forest for months, but the experience stayed with me, a vivid reminder that the natural world, while beautiful and tranquil, can also be unexpectedly dangerous. I became more cautious, more aware, and more respectful of isolation and wilderness. And while the memory of those nights haunted me, I also carried the lesson forward. Sometimes fear is real, not imagined, and paying attention to it can be the difference between safety and harm. I had been planning this solo trip to the cabin for months. The idea was simple: get away from everything, spend a week alone in the woods, and reset. I had never stayed alone in a remote cabin before, but I had done enough hiking and camping that I felt confident. The cabin was about a 3-hour drive from the nearest town, tucked into a dense forest with no neighbors for miles. The directions the owner had sent were precise, almost obsessive, and as I drove the winding dirt roads, I noticed the way the trees grew closer together, the way the shadows of the branches sprawled across the path like claws. It should have made me uneasy, but I told myself it was just part of the adventure. The drive was long and exhausting, the last stretch a rough dirt trail that shook the car with every bump and loose stone. When I finally reached the small clearing where the cabin sat, it was late afternoon. The cabin was a modest wooden structure, unpainted, with a sloped roof and a small porch. Smoke rose faintly from the chimney, though no one was around. The surrounding forest was dense and quiet, except for the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. I parked the car and stepped out, stretching, the smell of pine and damp earth filling the air. It was serene, almost too serene. I started with a routine check. The cabin had basic amenities: a small kitchen with a gas stove, a fridge that hummed softly, a bathroom with a shower, and a few bedrooms. There was firewood stacked neatly outside, and inside, a wood stove sat cold in the center of the main room. I unpacked my things slowly, taking my time, because I wanted to feel settled. After placing my gear in the small bedroom, I walked around, inspecting the windows, testing the locks, making sure everything was in order. It all seemed fine. Too fine, maybe. I tried not to overthink it. Evening came quickly. The sun dipped behind the trees, and the forest grew darker than I expected. I lit the wood stove, cooking a simple meal, feeling the heat spread across the cabin, making it feel less empty. I ate slowly, listening to the sound of the fire crackling, the wind brushing against the walls. I tried to imagine it as peaceful, a perfect escape. I told myself the night sounds were normal: animals, the wind, the occasional snap of a branch. Night fell fully, and with it, an eerie stillness. I could hear the forest more clearly now, the subtle shifts in the darkness. At first, it was just the normal sounds: an owl hooting, a deer moving somewhere nearby, the wind in the branches. But then I noticed small, unsettling things. A soft scrape at the side of the cabin, a dull thump from outside. Nothing that screamed danger, but enough to pull at the edge of my nerves. I forced myself to focus on the fire, telling myself I was imagining things. I went to bed, exhausted but uneasy. The cabin was silent except for the occasional creak of wood settling. Sleep came fitfully, broken by moments of awareness when I thought I heard someone or something moving just outside the window. I would lie still, staring into the darkness, listening. After a few hours, I drifted back into a restless sleep. Morning brought clarity, but not relief. When I opened the curtains, the forest was bright, sun spilling through the trees, casting long shadows. I convinced myself that the night had been paranoia. It was probably just animals. I ate breakfast, went through my gear, and decided to explore the area. The forest around the cabin was dense but navigable. I marked a path as I went, taking care not to lose my way. I wanted to stretch my legs and get fresh air, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the forest seemed almost too quiet, as if it was watching me in its own way. By late afternoon, I returned to the cabin tired and sweaty, grateful for the fire I had left going. I took a shower, changed into dry clothes, and sat in the main room thinking. That's when I first noticed something truly off. The front door, which I had locked that morning, was slightly ajar. Not wide open, just enough that I could see the edge of the frame. I was certain I had locked it. My heart rate spiked. I checked the locks carefully. They were intact. I didn't see any signs of forced entry. It didn't make sense. I walked the perimeter of the cabin, checking for footprints, anything that might explain the door. There were none. The ground around the cabin was soft from recent rain, and I could see plenty of tracks, mostly deer or rabbit, but nothing human. Still, the unease lingered. I felt watched, though I saw no one. I decided it was time to be extra cautious. I double-locked the doors, bolted the windows, and stacked firewood across the entrance. A small, almost irrational measure that somehow made me feel better. The next day, I ventured further into the forest, trying to keep busy, to take my mind off the cabin. But as I walked, I noticed things that unsettled me more. Broken branches, disturbed undergrowth, patterns that suggested someone had been moving through the area. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe hunters, maybe hikers, maybe animals. But the deeper I went, the more I realized the forest had changed subtly. There were areas where the dirt looked freshly disturbed, as if someone had made paths deliberately, yet not trails anyone would use normally. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every sound seemed magnified. The rustle of leaves, the occasional thump in the distance, the snap of twigs near the cabin. I stayed awake for hours, my mind running through possibilities. My imagination kept me tense, but I also felt something real, something tangible, like a presence that was patient, just observing. I checked the locks again, peered through the windows, but the forest looked calm, innocent almost. And yet, the feeling persisted. Over the next couple of days, I tried to maintain routine, but small things kept building tension. Food went missing, not all at once, but gradually. I had left a loaf of bread on the counter. Part of it disappeared. A bottle of water was partially empty even though I had drunk only what I measured. I would check the cabin thoroughly every morning and evening, but I never found any sign of how it happened. I began leaving small markers around the cabin. A twig on the door, a stone near the window. Each morning, they were disturbed. By the fourth night, the fear was gnawing at me constantly. I felt cornered in the cabin, trapped. The forest outside was beautiful, almost idyllic, but it also felt like a cage. That night, the wind was strong, rattling the windows and the door. I kept a fire going and paced the cabin, looking out every window. Around midnight, I saw movement shadows just beyond the treeline. I couldn't tell what it was, but the way it moved was deliberate, almost calculating. My heart pounded, and I could barely breathe. I debated leaving immediately, but the thought of venturing into the forest in darkness terrified me. I stayed alert until dawn, my eyes scanning every inch of the perimeter. When the first light touched the treetops, I ventured outside cautiously. The ground was undisturbed except for a few small tracks, too small to be human. It was as if the presence I had felt didn't leave a trace. I began to feel the weight of exhaustion, hunger, and fear all at once. The cabin, which had been a sanctuary, felt like a trap. I spent the next day preparing to leave. I packed my gear carefully, made sure the car was ready, and did a final sweep of the cabin. Nothing seemed overtly threatening now, but the unease had not left. I started the engine, drove slowly along the dirt road, and kept my eyes on the forest. Halfway back to the main road, I glanced in the rearview mirror and thought I saw someone standing just inside the trees, watching. When I blinked, it was gone. I drove without stopping until I reached the first town. The normalcy of human presence, the shops, the cars, the people walking on sidewalks, was overwhelming. I felt relief I didn't expect. I returned the cabin keys to the owner the next day, explaining that I had cut my stay short, though I didn't go into details. I told myself it was a combination of isolation and imagination, but the clarity of memory, the marks, the missing food, and the moments of movement in the forest told a different story. Weeks later, I looked back and realized what made it so terrifying wasn't just being alone. It was the way the cabin, the forest, and the unknown presence made every small sound, every minor anomaly, feel magnified. It was the helplessness of knowing someone or something had been near, had interacted with my space, without leaving clear evidence. That realization stayed with me longer than the memory of fear itself. The cabin was beautiful, the forest serene, but it had shown me a side of isolation I had never imagined. I never returned, and I never will. The experience taught me that the wilderness, while peaceful and restorative, also holds a kind of silent vigilance. It doesn't need to be supernatural to be terrifying. Awareness, preparedness, and caution matter more than comfort. And sometimes the most frightening things are simply human, or possibly human. In nature, watching, waiting, testing boundaries. I still think about that cabin often, not with longing, but with the clear understanding that solitude in the wrong. I had always thought of myself as someone who could handle isolation. I liked the idea of getting away from people, from cities, from the constant noise of the world. So, when I found a small cabin for rent deep in the mountains, surrounded by dense forest and far from any real roads. I didn't hesitate. It was the kind of place that promised peace, quiet, and a chance to disconnect entirely. I had spent weeks planning the trip, making sure I had every necessary supply: food, water, fuel, batteries, and even a small first aid kit. I thought I was ready for solitude. I quickly realized that being ready on paper and actually being ready were two entirely different things. The drive to the cabin was long and winding. The road started paved but gradually turned into a rough gravel track. The forest pressed closer with every mile, towering pines and hardwoods forming walls on either side, their branches arching over the road like skeletal fingers. I remember the light changing as I drove, the sun dropping behind the peaks and throwing long shadows across the uneven ground. It was beautiful, but it also carried a quiet weight, a sense of being watched by the sheer density of the trees. I tried to shrug it off as nerves, but the feeling lingered. When I finally reached the cabin, the sun had almost completely set. The place was small, wooden, with a tin roof that gleamed dimly in the last light. Smoke curled lazily from a stone chimney, suggesting recent use, but I couldn't smell the fire. The cabin sat on a slight rise, with a clearing of about 50 feet around it before the forest pressed back in. I parked my car on a patch of uneven dirt and got out, stretching my arms. The air was cool and smelled of pine and damp earth. I immediately noticed how silent it was. No birds, no insects, not even the wind seemed to move through the trees. The stillness was palpable, almost heavy. Inside, the cabin was simple but functional. There was a small kitchen area with a wood stove, a table with 2 chairs, and a tiny living space with a futon pushed against the wall. A ladder led up to a loft with a narrow mattress. I set my things down and started a fire in the stove. It took a few tries to get it going, the dry wood not catching as easily as I had hoped. Once it did, the flames cast long shadows on the walls, making the room feel warmer and more alive. I unpacked my food and water, made a quick sandwich, and sat by the fire for a while, listening. The silence outside was different from the silence I was used to in the city or even on a quiet street. It was a heavy, all-encompassing quiet, one that seemed to press against the walls of the cabin and seep in through the cracks around the windows. Night came fast in the mountains, faster than I remembered from my previous trips. The sun disappeared, and with it, any sense of the world beyond the trees. I went to the small loft, laid out my blanket, and tried to sleep, but I kept hearing small noises outside, branches cracking under some unseen weight, the rustle of leaves. At first, I told myself it was the wind, maybe a small animal, a deer moving through the woods. But after a while, the sounds didn't stop. They moved around the cabin. The snapping of twigs seemed deliberate, too precise to be random. I lay frozen under my blanket, listening, trying to convince myself that I was imagining it. But my heart was pounding, my breathing shallow, and I realized how unprepared I was for being completely alone in the middle of the forest. By morning, I felt tense, jumpy, and slightly nauseous. I made coffee on the wood stove and went outside to stretch my legs. The forest was beautiful in the daylight, mist curling between the trunks, sunlight breaking through in thin beams. I started to relax a little. I explored the small clearing around the cabin and found a faint trail leading deeper into the woods. It wasn't on the map, and I hadn't planned to hike, but I felt compelled to see where it went. I walked a few hundred feet before deciding to turn back. The path disappeared into shadows that seemed impossibly dense, and I didn't want to risk getting lost. Still, the sense of unease from the previous night didn't fully leave me. That evening, after the sun had gone down again, I noticed something that made my stomach tighten. There were footprints in the dirt outside the cabin. Human footprints. I had walked around that morning, and I was certain there had been none. These prints were fresh, and they weren't mine. They led from the edge of the clearing toward the cabin and stopped right outside the door. I checked the locks, my hands trembling. Everything was intact, nothing missing, but the feeling of being watched returned with a vengeance. I stayed inside, sitting close to the fire, a large kitchen knife on the table in front of me. I tried to make myself focus on the flames, but every shadow outside seemed to stretch and twist, as though reaching toward me. Sleep was impossible that night. Every snap of a branch, every whisper of the wind, made me jump. I kept imagining someone, or something, moving just beyond the line of sight. Around 2 in the morning, I heard the distinct sound of footsteps approaching the cabin again. This time, it was deliberate, slow, methodical. I gripped the knife and waited. The steps stopped near the door, and then I heard something scratch against the wood. Not heavy, like an animal, but careful, intentional. My body went rigid. I didn't move for what felt like hours, barely daring to breathe. Eventually, the sound stopped. I waited until sunrise, my senses taut like a drawn wire. During the day, I considered leaving, but I didn't have cell service, and the nearest road was several miles away. Driving in daylight would be safer, but I had no guarantee the person, or people, outside weren't still near the forest. I decided I needed to be prepared. I gathered firewood, sharpened my knife, and set up a few crude alarms outside, twigs tied together with string that would fall and make noise if stepped on. Every rustle of leaves or snap of a twig made my pulse jump, but the alarms gave me a small measure of control. I realized that fear was less about what might happen and more about feeling helpless, and the alarms made me feel like I could do something if it did happen. That night, the tension was unbearable. The steps returned, and this time I could hear a voice muttering low, unintelligible words, probably not directed at me, but the knowledge that someone was moving outside, so close, sent waves of terror through me. I stayed in the loft, knife in hand, and didn't move until dawn. When the first light hit, I cautiously checked outside. Nothing. No prints. No signs of anyone. I knew, though, that they had been there. Someone had watched me all night. Over the next 2 days, I stayed hypervigilant. I kept the fire burning, patrolled the clearing, and stayed in the loft at night. The sense of being watched never left. I started keeping track of time, noting when the steps came, how often the scratching occurred. Eventually, I noticed a pattern. The intrusions only came at night and only when I moved too far from the cabin. The realization hit me hard. I wasn't safe leaving the cabin. The woods around me weren't just empty trees. They were territory for someone else, someone who knew the area better than I did. The fear that had been abstract became very concrete. I had to survive until I could get help. On the 4th night, I stayed awake the entire time. I barely ate, barely slept, and kept the fire blazing. Around midnight, the steps came again, slower this time, as though the person outside was testing me. I held the knife tightly, my ears straining. Then I remembered the small camping flare I had packed for emergencies. If someone tried to enter, I could light it and create a blinding, startling signal. When the steps got close, I grabbed the flare, pulled the trigger, and a bright, sudden flare shot up into the air, lighting the clearing like daylight. I heard a startled shout, then footsteps retreating into the forest. My chest heaved as adrenaline surged through me. The flare burned out, leaving me in the quiet again, but I knew the immediate threat had gone. The next morning, I packed quickly. I knew I couldn't stay another night. I drove down the gravel road as fast as I dared, constantly scanning the tree line, half expecting someone to appear. The drive took hours, the isolation making every sound of my car echo unnaturally. Finally, I reached a small town at the base of the mountains. I reported the situation to the local sheriff, who seemed unsurprised. Apparently, the area had a small group of people who liked to follow hikers and campers, sometimes breaking into cabins. They hadn't been caught yet, but the sheriff assured me they would investigate. After that, I went home, shaken but alive. I realized that fear doesn't always come from monsters or ghosts. It can come from very real, very human threats, from being alone and vulnerable in a place you thought was safe. I never returned to that cabin, and I never went back into that forest. But I did learn something important. Preparation, awareness, and staying calm can be the difference between surviving and becoming another story. Every time I think about that trip, I remember the darkness, the isolation, and the constant feeling of being watched. But I also remember the clarity of mind I needed to survive, the careful steps I took to protect myself, and the relief when I finally saw people again. I never thought a weekend alone in a cabin could feel so heavy. I had planned this trip for months, imagining myself escaping the constant noise of the city, leaving behind the hum of traffic, the endless notifications, the chatter of people I didn't even know well but still had to deal with. The cabin itself was nothing fancy, tucked into a thick patch of woods about an hour from the nearest town. A simple wooden structure with a small porch, a stone fireplace, and windows that looked out into the trees in every direction. From the photos online, it had seemed peaceful, even inviting. But as I drove down the winding dirt road leading up to it, lined on either side by thick pines and birch trees, I felt an unease that I couldn't explain. The forest was dense, older than any forest I had seen near the city, and it seemed to absorb sound. The wind in the branches had a sharpness to it, cutting through the warm late summer air like a knife. I parked the car near the cabin, feeling the gravel crunch under my tires. The engine cut off, and in that sudden silence, the forest seemed to settle around me, almost pressing close, waiting. The cabin was small, maybe 2 rooms and a loft above, and it smelled faintly of wood polish and something old, something like dust and damp. I carried my bags in, noticing the way the light from the late afternoon sun fell across the wooden floorboards, highlighting knots and scratches I hadn't seen in the pictures. I set my things down and started to unpack, stacking clothes in the small dresser and lining up food in the kitchen. There was a small stove, a sink with running water, and a basic refrigerator. I even found a box of matches and a stack of firewood near the fireplace. Everything seemed functional, normal, safe. I spent the first hour walking around the property, inspecting it, even though I knew it was unnecessary. A small clearing surrounded the cabin, with the forest pressing in closely on all sides. There was a creek nearby, its water clear and bubbling over rocks. I could see some deer tracks near the edge of the clearing, and I felt a brief spark of joy imagining them wandering at night under the moonlight. The air was sweet with pine and moss, almost intoxicating, and I thought about how different this felt from the city, how calm, how quiet. I told myself I had made the right choice coming here alone. By late afternoon, the shadows in the forest were growing long. The sun filtered through the trees in thin beams, and I started the fire in the fireplace. It crackled and popped, filling the room with a warmth that contrasted with the cooling air outside. I made myself a cup of coffee and sat in the small armchair near the fire, looking at the woods through the window. That's when I first noticed the sound, a faint rustling, like someone walking just beyond the edge of the clearing. My stomach tightened. I told myself it was the wind, or maybe an animal, nothing more. The forest was alive, full of small creatures, after all. But even as I tried to reason it away, my senses sharpened. I could hear branches snapping in the distance, soft but deliberate. My first instinct was to go out and check, to see if I could spot a deer or a raccoon, but something in me froze. I didn't want to confront whatever it was, and the idea of stepping into the thick, shadowed trees alone suddenly felt reckless. Night fell quickly. The forest outside the windows darkened to a thick black, only the moonlight illuminating patches through the leaves. The fire was low, and the crackle of wood filled the cabin with the only sound besides the occasional whisper of wind. I tried to focus on reading, pulling a book off the shelf, but I kept glancing at the windows. Each time I did, I swore I saw movement, something shifting behind the trees, but every time I looked directly, nothing was there. I tried to tell myself it was my imagination, that the human brain tended to invent threats in the dark, but it was difficult to convince myself when the rustling persisted, slow, cautious, almost measured. I decided to lock the doors. The cabin had a simple deadbolt on the front and back doors, and I turned each one slowly, listening as the mechanism clicked into place. Even the sound of metal against metal felt reassuring, grounding me in the reality that I was alone but secure, that I could at least control my immediate environment. I checked the windows, making sure they latched. I sat back down near the fire, trying to slow my breathing, to calm the rising tension in my chest. Hours passed. I tried to sleep in the loft, a small bed with a thin mattress, but the sounds of the forest outside kept me on edge. Every crack of a branch, every rustle of leaves made me flinch. At some point, I realized I had been imagining footsteps that didn't exist. Or maybe they did exist. I could no longer tell. I tried to focus on the patterns of light and shadow, the simple logic that the forest was full of life and not everything was dangerous. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Around 2 in the morning, I woke to a sharp sound, a branch breaking close to the cabin. I froze, lying on my back, listening. There was a pause, then another crack, closer this time. My heart hammered. I forced myself out of bed, moving quietly, testing the floorboards for creaks. I grabbed a heavy flashlight from the kitchen counter, the kind I had packed thinking I might need it for walking the path to the creek at night. Holding it tightly, I edged toward the door, planning to check outside. But before I opened it, I heard it, the sound of someone breathing just beyond the porch. I froze, gripping the flashlight so tightly my knuckles whitened. Whoever it was, they weren't making the rustling of animals. This was deliberate, careful. The slow inhalation, the almost inaudible exhalation, it felt methodical. And for the first time, I realized I was not just uneasy, I was in danger. I stepped back, thinking about what to do. My phone was in my bag, but there was no signal here. Calling for help was useless. I had to rely on my own instincts. I spent the next hour moving silently, checking every door and window. I kept the flashlight ready, moving it slowly across the edges of the clearing, trying to see any shape, any movement. Nothing appeared. The forest was still, and yet I knew I was not alone. The thought of someone walking around my cabin in the dark, hidden in the trees, made my stomach twist. I realized I had to stay awake, to monitor every sound, to prepare for the possibility that someone might try to enter. By morning, I was exhausted, but the forest seemed quieter. The air had a colder, sharper edge, and the mist rising from the creek made everything look pale and muted. I didn't sleep, didn't let my guard down for a moment. Instead, I packed some supplies, grabbed the car keys, and started the walk back to the dirt road, keeping the cabin within my line of sight. The forest was deceptive in daylight. Shadows that had seemed sinister at night were now harmless tree trunks, the rustling leaves, the wind brushing through branches. Still, I moved cautiously, scanning constantly. When I reached the car, I locked the doors behind me and sat inside, breathing hard, letting the engine idle for a few minutes before starting the drive back. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see a figure among the trees. But there was nothing, only the forest, quiet and still. I drove slowly, aware of every bump in the road, every curve, every sound. It took an hour to reach the paved road, and by the time I hit it, the sense of threat had faded just slightly, replaced by a deep, bone-weary exhaustion. I reported the incident to the local authorities when I got to town. They took my account seriously, sent someone to inspect the cabin and surrounding area. From what I learned later, the cabin was near a spot frequented by illegal hunters and trespassers. There were no signs of anyone inside the cabin itself, no footprints on the porch, but tracks in the woods suggested someone had been watching or approaching, maybe waiting, maybe planning. I realized how lucky I had been, how carefully I had handled the situation, and how quickly the danger could have turned fatal if I had not stayed alert. Weeks later, I returned to the city with a new respect for isolation and the hidden risks in seemingly peaceful places. I never went back to that cabin, and I never stayed alone in a remote place again without first checking the area carefully and having a plan. The forest, I realized, was neither good nor evil. It was indifferent, and it was the people, the other humans hidden in it, who were capable of danger. I learned to trust my instincts, to respect my own limitations, and to value the simple things. Locks that work, windows that secure, roads that are visible. I also learned that being prepared, alert, and calm can be the difference between a scary situation and a tragedy. Sitting at home, I sometimes remember that night, the dark forest pressing in, the soft but deliberate steps, the shadowed shapes moving between trees. I remember how I stayed calm, how I listened, how I survived. It was terrifying, yes, but it was also a lesson in clarity and awareness. And in the end, I walked away, unharmed, with the memory of fear still vivid, but balanced by the knowledge that I had handled it, that I had been smart enough to protect myself. That clarity, that careful observation, and that readiness became something I carried with me into every remote I remember the day I decided to go to the cabin clearly, even now, years later. It was a late September morning, the kind of crisp autumn day when the sun is still warm enough to feel pleasant, but the air carries a subtle sharpness that hints winter is not far away. I had been working almost non-stop for months, and the stress had piled up until I felt like I could barely breathe in my own apartment. I didn't want a fancy resort or a crowded lodge. I wanted a place that felt isolated, far away from anyone, where I could be entirely alone and just exist without anyone expecting anything of me. I found a cabin for rent online, nestled deep in the woods in a rural area several hours from the city. The photos looked simple but charming, and the reviews suggested it was quiet and private. That was all I needed. The drive there was long. I had packed my car with groceries, camping gear, extra blankets, and a small first aid kit, more out of habit than expectation. The route wound through narrow, wooded roads, the kind that barely allowed 2 cars to pass without brushing branches along the sides. The further I drove, the quieter it became. Cell service dropped almost entirely halfway through the journey, and I remember feeling a twinge of unease, but it was mixed with anticipation. The isolation felt liberating at first. I kept telling myself that this was exactly what I needed, a chance to recharge, away from all the noise and obligations. By the time I arrived, the sun was already dipping below the horizon, casting long, dark shadows through the tall pine trees that surrounded the cabin. It was a small wooden structure, roughly built but sturdy, with a stone chimney that suggested it could get very warm if I managed the fire correctly. There was a small porch, a stack of firewood neatly piled beside it, and a rusty metal lantern hanging near the door. The air smelled strongly of pine and damp earth. I pulled my bags out of the car, feeling the crunch of fallen leaves under my boots, and unlocked the door. Inside, it was dusty, with the faint smell of mildew, but otherwise the cabin was clean. There was a small kitchen area, a table with 2 chairs, and a living space with a worn sofa and a wood-burning stove. The bedroom was tiny, with a narrow bed and thick, rough blankets folded neatly at the foot. I spent the first hour unpacking, lighting the stove, and organizing my supplies. I checked the windows and doors, making sure they all locked properly. Something about being alone in a cabin so far from anything always makes you more cautious, even when there is no real reason to be. I made a simple dinner of canned soup and bread, ate slowly, and washed up using the small sink connected to a gravity-fed water system that ran from a nearby stream. By the time I finished, the night had fully fallen. The darkness outside the windows was complete and deep, interrupted only by the occasional flicker of moonlight and the swaying shadows of trees in the wind. I tried to read for a while to calm myself, but the silence was almost oppressive. Every creak of the wooden floor, every rustle from outside, seemed unnaturally loud. The walls, the windows, the very air felt alive with movement I could not see. I kept thinking about small things, how the cabin had clearly been empty for months, how no one would hear me if something went wrong, how far I was from the nearest road. Rationally, I knew I was safe, but emotionally, I couldn't shake a feeling of being watched. I told myself it was just nerves, that the isolation had heightened my senses. Eventually, I went to bed, lying under the thick blankets, feeling the chill seep in from the floorboards and the walls, and tried to sleep. The wind rattled the windows, and somewhere outside, a branch snapped sharply. I told myself it was a deer or a raccoon, something harmless. I woke several times during the night to noises I couldn't identify. At one point, I thought I heard footsteps outside the cabin, crunching through the leaves. I froze under the blankets, straining to listen. The sound stopped, then started again, this time slower, deliberate, and closer. My heart pounded. I realized the front door, which I had locked, was still secure. I told myself it must be an animal, but the steps were too heavy, too even. I stayed under the blankets, breathing shallowly, listening as the sounds moved around the perimeter of the cabin. They faded into the distance after what felt like an hour. I didn't sleep again for the rest of the night, only dozed fitfully, listening to the forest around me, trying to convince myself that no human could have reached this far without a vehicle. When morning finally came, I got up and checked the perimeter of the cabin. There were no footprints, no broken branches, Nothing to suggest anyone had been outside during the night. I told myself my mind had played tricks on me, that the fear of isolation had made ordinary sounds seem sinister. I made a hearty breakfast, brewed some strong coffee, and sat on the porch, letting the sunlight warm my stiff muscles. The forest looked peaceful in the daylight, almost inviting. I walked to the nearby stream to refill my water supply, the sound of running water soothing me after the terror of the previous night. That afternoon, I explored the area around the cabin. I found a faint trail leading deeper into the woods, barely visible through the undergrowth. Curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to follow it for a short distance. The trail wound between tall trees and over fallen logs. Birds called occasionally, and small animals rustled in the underbrush. About an hour in, I heard a distant snapping sound behind me, like a branch breaking underfoot. But when I turned, nothing was there. I quickened my pace back toward the cabin. The sun was already starting to lower, and I didn't want to be far from shelter as darkness approached again. That evening, I decided to be cautious. I made a large fire in the stove, set out candles, and made sure the locks were secure. I prepared a simple dinner again, but I could feel my nerves fraying. The previous night's experience had left me on edge. Around 9 o'clock, the sound began again. A subtle scratching, like fingernails against wood, came from the direction of the back of the cabin. I froze, straining to hear. The noise stopped, then returned, louder this time. My rational mind told me it was probably a raccoon or a stray dog, but every instinct screamed otherwise. I grabbed the small hatchet I had brought for chopping firewood, holding it as I moved toward the source of the sound. I peeked through a back window and saw a figure standing just beyond the edge of the tree line. It was motionless, and I could barely make out details, but the outline was unmistakably human. I slammed the window shut and backed away slowly, my heart racing. I checked all the doors and windows again, making sure they were locked. I moved furniture in front of the main door as an extra precaution, even though I knew it wouldn't stop someone determined. Hours passed without incident, but I didn't sleep again. I stayed alert, listening to every sound outside, the hatchet ready in my hands. By morning, I realized I couldn't stay in the cabin any longer without taking steps to protect myself. I packed essential items into my car, making sure the doors were locked, and drove back toward the nearest town, stopping only when I felt I was safely away from the forest. I called the local authorities and reported the incident, though I had no proof beyond my account. They noted it but told me the area was very isolated and that it was difficult to respond quickly to such calls. I accepted this with frustration and relief, grateful to be leaving the forest behind. In the days that followed, I reflected on what had happened. The experience left me shaken, but I realized that my fear had been fueled as much by isolation and imagination as by the actual threat. Still, I had learned the value of preparation, awareness, and trusting instincts in potentially dangerous situations. I never returned to that cabin, but I did take measures to protect myself in future trips, always letting someone know exactly where I was, keeping a means of defense close at hand, and never underestimating the unpredictability of the woods. The experience stayed with me, a reminder of how quickly peace can turn into fear when isolation leaves you vulnerable, and how careful observation, cautious planning, and decisive action are crucial to surviving such moments. Eventually, I found other cabins and hiking trips that were safer, better monitored, and less isolated. I enjoyed them without the terror I experienced that September. And though I never went back to that particular cabin, I think about it sometimes, imagining what that figure was and why it had chosen that remote place. I have come to accept that the woods hold secrets I may never fully understand, but I also know that my own choices, preparation, and calmness under pressure were what ultimately kept me safe. That knowledge has given me a cautious confidence that I carry into every wilderness experience. A sense that even in the quietest, most isolated places, careful attention to detail and respect for my surroundings can make the difference between a terrifying night and a safe, fulfilling adventure. I had been planning the trip for months, drawn by the quiet isolation of the mountains and the idea of being entirely alone for a while. Work had been suffocating, emails piling up, calls never ending, and the constant pressure of deadlines had left me tense and restless. The thought of sitting in a small cabin, miles from anyone, with only the forest around me and a creek nearby, felt like freedom. The cabin itself was nothing fancy, just a small wooden structure tucked between thick pine trees, but it had a simple charm, with a stone fireplace, a small kitchen, and enough space for one person to live comfortably. It had been empty for years, used only occasionally by hikers or hunters, which is what appealed to me most. The isolation meant I could think, relax, and truly disconnect. I arrived mid-afternoon, driving my old SUV along a narrow gravel road that wound its way up the mountainside. The sun was low, golden light filtering through the trees, casting long shadows across the road. I remember the moment when I first saw the cabin. It was smaller than I expected, partially hidden behind a thick stand of pines, and the wooden siding had darkened with age. Some of the shingles on the roof were missing, and the small porch sagged slightly on one side. Yet it looked solid enough. The air smelled of wet earth and pine, a mix of freshness and decay that only deep woods could produce. I parked, grabbed my backpack, and unlocked the cabin door. The interior was dusty, untouched for months, maybe years. The floors creaked as I walked through the small living area. Sunlight filtered through the grimy windows, revealing motes of dust dancing in the air. There was a faint smell of mildew, old wood, and something metallic, probably from the leaky roof. I set down my bags and began unpacking, laying out the food I'd brought, my flashlight, extra batteries, and the small first aid kit I had packed with meticulous care. I had planned to spend 4 days there, and I wanted to be prepared. The first evening passed without incident. I cleaned up a bit, swept the floor, and made a fire in the fireplace. The sound of the crackling wood was comforting, a reminder that I wasn't entirely alone. Outside, the wind whispered through the trees, and I could hear the creek running steadily down the slope, a constant, reassuring background noise. I cooked a simple dinner on the small stove, ate slowly, and settled into the armchair by the fire. Darkness fell quickly in the mountains, faster than I was used to in the city, and soon I was enveloped in silence, broken only by the occasional rustle of an animal outside. I slept well that first night, waking only once to the sound of what I thought was a deer stepping on branches. The second day, I decided to explore the area. I walked along the creek, noticing the way the water ran over rocks, white and foamy in some places, dark and still in others. I found old animal tracks in the mud, maybe a bear, maybe a large deer. The forest was dense, sunlight barely reaching the forest floor in some places, and I had to duck under low-hanging branches and push past thick ferns. It was exhausting, but in a satisfying way. I felt alive, connected to the environment in a way that I hadn't felt in years. When I returned to the cabin, I noticed something I hadn't seen before: a small, shallow hole dug near the back of the cabin, close to the foundation. It was roughly a foot wide, as if an animal had been digging. I didn't think much of it at first. Animals dug holes all the time, perhaps a raccoon or a fox. I made a mental note to check it later, but didn't worry. That night, however, was different. I had gone to bed early, fire dying down to embers, and the wind had picked up. It was colder than expected, the kind of cold that seeps into your bones. Around midnight, I woke to a sound outside, faint but distinct, the soft crunch of gravel, the kind of sound a footstep makes. My heart raced, but I reminded myself of the isolation. Maybe a hiker had gotten lost, maybe an animal. I stayed perfectly still, listening. The sound stopped after a few seconds. I told myself I was imagining it and tried to go back to sleep. The next morning, I inspected the cabin more carefully. The hole behind the cabin had grown slightly, as if dug further. This unsettled me. Animals didn't usually dig so close to a building's foundation. I checked the perimeter of the cabin, looking for tracks or signs of anything larger. There were faint footprints in the mud, partially washed away by last night's light rain. I crouched to examine them. They were human, small, but unmistakably human. My stomach tightened. I spent the day keeping busy. I collected firewood, repaired a few weak boards on the porch, and cleaned the cabin more thoroughly. Every little sound outside, branches snapping, leaves rustling, made me jump. The isolation I had once found peaceful now felt heavy. I kept the fire going all day, a source of warmth and comfort, though I had begun to notice that the wind was stronger than usual. That evening, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. One of the windows in the back of the cabin had been smeared with something dark, almost like mud, but thicker. I wiped it cautiously, revealing the clear glass underneath, but the presence of it was enough. Someone had been near the cabin while I was out. I searched the cabin again, making sure nothing was missing. Everything seemed untouched inside, but my sense of safety was gone. I stayed awake for much of the night, fire glowing in the hearth, flashlight in hand, listening to every sound. Around 2 in the morning, I heard the crunch of gravel again. This time multiple steps, deliberate, moving around the cabin. My heart raced uncontrollably. I had no phone signal, no way to call for help. I considered leaving, but the roads were muddy and treacherous, and the idea of stepping outside into the dark, into whoever was out there, was terrifying. I huddled near the fireplace, trying to keep calm, telling myself that perhaps it was just a transient hiker who had wandered too close. The next day, I decided to act cautiously. I packed essentials into my backpack in case I needed to leave suddenly. I checked all the windows and doors, making sure they were locked and barricaded if necessary. I found more footprints around the cabin, small and deliberate, circling the structure. My sense of paranoia intensified, every shadow now seeming to contain movement, every rustle a threat. By the third day, the intrusions became more obvious. The hole behind the cabin had been enlarged significantly, and I could see the faint outline of a larger footprint pressed into the damp earth. I started noticing small items shifted slightly in the cabin, nothing major, just subtle differences in placement that made me feel watched. I realized that whoever had been around had been careful, moving slowly, avoiding detection, but leaving enough evidence to make their presence undeniable. I spent hours fortifying the cabin, setting heavy objects against doors and windows, and improvising traps with sticks and rocks that would make noise if disturbed. I felt like I was in a war zone. On the 4th day, I made the decision to leave. I could not spend another night in that cabin with the knowledge that someone had been watching me. The roads were still muddy, the forest dense, but I prepared my SUV for the journey back. As I loaded my backpack, I noticed something on the porch. A small, crudely carved message into the wood. It was barely legible, but it was enough to make my skin crawl. Someone had been here. Someone had been close enough to leave a message. I left the cabin quickly, driving down the narrow road, heart pounding with every shadow and bend in the path. The forest seemed oppressive, the trees pressing in from both sides. I felt eyes on me the entire way down, though I knew it was just my imagination fueled by fear. When I finally reached the main road, I felt an overwhelming relief, the tension in my shoulders easing for the first time in days. I reported the incident to the local authorities when I reached the nearest town. They took my statement seriously, though they mentioned the cabin had been abandoned for years, occasionally used by hikers, and there had been other reports of theft and intrusion in the area. They said they would check the cabin and monitor the property. I learned later that they had found evidence of a small group of squatters using the cabin, people who had been living there illegally and had been careful to avoid detection but left traces when I stayed. The experience changed me. I realized how vulnerable one can be, even in a place that seems isolated and secure. I still love the mountains, still hike occasionally, but I never return to abandoned places, never stay alone in a cabin far from civilization. The fear and tension I felt in those days are impossible to forget, etched into my memory with every detail. The smell of the old wood, the sound of footsteps on gravel, the sight of the dug hole behind the cabin. And yet, there was a strange satisfaction in knowing I had survived, that I had taken the right precautions, and that I had trusted my instincts. The cabin itself remains in my mind like a lesson learned. Isolation can be peaceful, but it can also be dangerous when unknown human threats are involved. I left with a newfound respect for preparation, awareness, and the thin line between comfort and danger in the wilderness. I returned home safely, and though the memories still bring a chill, I know I handled the situation responsibly, and that knowledge I had been planning the trip for months, thinking of it as a simple escape. My life had been heavy for a while, and I just wanted to get away, to breathe in the kind of silence that only deep woods can provide. I found a cabin listed online, isolated, far enough from any town to make a weekend feel like a retreat into another world. The pictures were simple but inviting. A small wooden structure with a tin roof, a porch that ran along the front, and a small chimney that promised warmth if I needed it. The listing assured electricity and running water, but it was clear that this cabin had not been modernized much. That was exactly what I wanted. The drive there was long. My car wound through narrow country roads, flanked by dense forest on both sides. The sky was overcast, the clouds low, heavy with the possibility of rain. I remember thinking it was perfect for the mood I wanted. Isolation, quiet, a break from the constant noise of life. As I drove, I saw no other vehicles. Every now and then, I caught the movement of a bird or a deer in the underbrush. I told myself to focus on the peace of it, but deep down, there was a subtle tension. Roads like this always seemed too empty, too quiet. When I finally reached the cabin, I felt relief and satisfaction. It was small, sturdy, and completely surrounded by forest. The driveway was little more than dirt, rutted with tire marks that suggested at least occasional visitors. I parked my car, grabbed my bags, and walked up to the cabin, listening to the crunch of gravel and fallen leaves under my feet. The air was thick, smelling faintly of wet pine and moss. I took a long breath, feeling a strange mix of contentment and unease. The cabin itself was simple but solid. Inside, the floors creaked slightly with each step, the wood smelling faintly of smoke and damp. There was a small kitchen area, a living space with a fireplace, and a single bedroom. Everything was functional, though nothing seemed used recently. Dust lay on surfaces, and there was the faint, musty smell that often comes from an empty cabin. I unpacked my things slowly, deliberately, enjoying the quiet. I even made a small fire in the fireplace, the crackle of the wood filling the otherwise still room. Outside, the wind whispered through the trees, and I could hear the distant rattle of branches against one another. That night, I slept lightly. The cabin made sounds I was not used to. Wood shifted, the wind pushed against the walls, and sometimes I thought I heard the distant snap of branches, though it could have been the wind or a small animal. I woke several times, staring at the dark corners of the room, feeling my heart rate rise for no reason other than the sheer emptiness around me. By morning, I was alert, almost too alert, noticing every small sound, every shift in the light. The next day, I decided to explore the surrounding area. There was a narrow trail behind the cabin that led deeper into the woods. I had a backpack with water, some food, and a small first aid kit, things I always carried when hiking. The trail was uneven, covered in roots and loose stones, but it wasn't particularly dangerous. Still, the forest was dense, the trees tall and close together, blocking most of the sky. I moved carefully, listening to the occasional rustle in the underbrush. Birds called to one another in distant branches, but otherwise, the forest was quiet in a way that felt unnatural. Hours passed as I wandered. I noted small details, like the way the moss grew thicker on the north side of the trees, how the sunlight barely touched the ground, and how the underbrush became denser as I moved further in. I even found a small stream, the water moving over smooth stones, cool and clear. I stopped there, drinking some from my water bottle, feeling a sense of calm wash over me. For a brief moment, it felt like I could leave the world behind entirely. But as the day progressed, I noticed something. The forest didn't seem as empty as I had thought. Branches snapped in the distance, far enough away that I could convince myself it was deer or some other animal. But the noises were irregular, different from what I was used to. Something about them didn't feel natural. My mind started to wander toward uncomfortable possibilities, even though I knew I was probably overthinking. Still, the feeling of being watched crept in. I started keeping my head on a swivel, more aware of every sound, every shadow. By late afternoon, I decided to head back to the cabin. The path seemed longer on the way back. Every fallen log looked like an obstacle. Every rustle in the leaves made me pause. I tried to ignore it, telling myself I was imagining things, but my hands were slightly trembling as I walked. When I finally emerged from the dense underbrush and saw the cabin in the distance, relief surged through me. I felt safe again, at least momentarily. I spent the evening preparing a simple dinner, heating canned food over the fire. I tried to focus on mundane tasks: cleaning, organizing, checking the cabin for anything broken. But even with the lights on and the fire crackling, the feeling didn't go away. The woods were just beyond the walls, dark and thick, and I knew I wasn't alone in the sense that humans could be there. I didn't see anyone, but the emptiness felt wrong. The air seemed heavier, and I caught myself flinching at minor sounds. A branch tapping the roof, the wind shaking the window. That night, I slept even less. The sounds were sharper in the dark, closer than before. At one point, I woke to what sounded like footsteps on the porch. I froze, straining my ears. The steps stopped after a moment, but the pause itself was worse than movement. My imagination started to spiral, imagining someone outside, watching, waiting. I didn't check the window. I didn't want to see. I tried to convince myself it was nothing. A branch, a raccoon, the wind, but the pit in my stomach grew. I eventually fell into a shallow, restless sleep. The next morning, I resolved to stay vigilant. I checked all the doors and windows, making sure they were locked, though the locks themselves were simple, not very secure. I packed a small bag with essentials and carried a flashlight and a kitchen knife, just in case. I didn't plan to leave, but I needed a sense of security. The forest was quiet again, deceptively quiet. During the day, I noticed more things. I found footprints in the dirt near the cabin. Not animal prints, too large and oddly shaped, though it was hard to tell exactly. They seemed to lead into the woods but didn't come back. At first, I thought I was seeing things, but the shapes were too distinct. I examined them carefully, taking photos with my phone. My heart raced. Whoever or whatever had been here had passed through recently. The realization that I might not be alone changed everything. I could no longer walk the forest carelessly. I stayed close to the cabin, watching the trees, listening to the wind, trying to decipher every sound. Hours dragged by slowly, each one heavy with tension. I realized how unprepared I had been for the psychological weight of isolation combined with the possibility of another person, or people, being nearby. By nightfall, the tension became almost unbearable. I reinforced the doors with a chair against the handle, moved furniture in front of windows, and kept the fire going in the fireplace. I didn't dare go outside, even briefly. The air was cooler now, damp and smelling of wet leaves. Shadows stretched long against the walls as the fire flickered. Every sound was magnified. The wind, the creak of the cabin, the occasional distant snap of a branch. I lay on the bed with my knife in my hand, unable to sleep, too tense to even close my eyes fully. Then I heard it. Soft, deliberate tapping on the roof. One tap, pause, another tap, pause, then several more in a pattern that was unmistakably intentional. Someone was on the roof, walking, moving. My body froze. I knew I couldn't stay passive. I had to act. I considered my options carefully. The front door was reinforced, but the back door had a small latch I could open. There were windows, but they were small, and climbing through them in the dark would be risky. I decided the safest option was to wait until the person made a mistake or left. Hours passed like this, the tapping intermittent, never stopping completely. I stayed in the shadows, hidden, listening, heart racing, breathing shallowly. My mind ran through every possible scenario, every horror story I had ever heard about isolated cabins. I knew panic would be dangerous, but my body trembled anyway. By morning, the tapping had ceased, but the tension remained. I cautiously inspected the exterior of the cabin and saw no signs of anyone remaining. No footprints other than mine and the faint ones from the previous day. No signs of forced entry. I stayed one more night, tense but calmer. The next day, I decided I had had enough. I packed everything quickly, leaving the cabin as I had found it. I drove back slowly, still alert, scanning the trees on either side of the road. I told myself it had been someone passing through, someone curious or reckless, not intending real harm. But I couldn't shake the feeling that the woods were watching, that the isolation had amplified a sense of vulnerability I had never experienced before. When I I had been driving all day, the kind of long, empty highway that stretches for miles with nothing but trees on either side. The kind that makes the hours feel like minutes and then minutes feel like hours. The sun had begun to dip low behind the thick line of pines, casting long shadows over the road. I had been planning this trip for months. Just me, the cabin, and the quiet I craved. I wanted a break from everything. Work, noise, emails, responsibilities that always seemed to multiply faster than I could handle. I didn't want people. I didn't want calls. I didn't want interruptions. I wanted to disappear for a week and just exist somewhere that felt removed from the rest of the world. The cabin itself wasn't far off the main road, but the turnoff was easy to miss. A narrow dirt track veered sharply to the left, half covered in overgrown grass and fallen pine needles. I slowed, careful not to hit the small ruts that ran across the path. The GPS had stopped picking up the signal hours ago, so I had no choice but to trust the map I printed weeks ago. That, and instinct. After a few minutes of creeping along the uneven track, the trees finally opened up to a small clearing. The cabin sat there, wooden and weathered, with a steep roof and a small porch. Smoke rose lazily from the chimney, though I knew it probably wasn't real. No one had been there, and the cabin was uninhabited. It had been listed online as remote and secluded, and that had been all the information I needed. I parked, the gravel crunching under the tires, and stepped out. The air smelled of pine and damp earth. It was quiet in the way that only deep forests can be quiet. The kind of quiet that isn't just an absence of sound, but a presence of stillness that makes you feel like the world has stopped moving. I pulled my backpack from the trunk and made my way up to the porch. The wood groaned under my weight, old and swollen from rain and age. The door had a simple latch, and after a little struggle, it gave way. Inside, the cabin was dim but dry. The wood paneling was dark, the floorboards uneven but solid. Dust floated in the air, visible in the beams of the late afternoon sun that filtered through the small windows. There was a small kitchen with a sink and cabinets, a wood stove in the corner, and a few basic pieces of furniture. A table, 2 chairs, and a bed with a thin mattress and a faded quilt. Nothing luxurious, nothing modern, just enough to survive a week. I set my bag down and walked slowly through the cabin, touching the surfaces, noticing the small details. Scratches on the floor where furniture had been moved, a dented metal can in the corner that had probably once held beans or rice, the slight smell of mildew behind the stove. It all felt real, untouched by anyone recently, and for the first time in weeks, I felt a strange kind of relief. No notifications, no hum of electronics, no deadlines. I unpacked the essentials: food, clothes, a notebook, and a flashlight. I had brought enough to last a week, even if something went wrong, and I made sure the matches were dry. The stove had fuel, and the water bottles were full. By the time I finished setting up, the sun had vanished behind the trees, leaving the forest around me deep in shadow. I lit the stove, enjoying the warmth that spread through the cabin as the wood caught and the first small flames licked the metal. Outside, the sounds of the forest began to change as night fell. Birds had stopped their calls, replaced by the occasional rustle of something moving in the underbrush. A distant branch snapped, echoing louder than it should in the quiet. I felt a small shiver, but it wasn't fear. It was just awareness. I was aware that I was alone, really alone, farther from anyone than I had ever been. I cooked a simple dinner on the stove, beans and rice, seasoned with a small bit of salt I had brought. The act of preparing food felt grounding, normal, and necessary. I ate slowly, listening to the faint creaks of the cabin settling and the deeper sounds outside. The wind had started, or maybe it had been blowing softly all along, carrying the scent of pine and the faint smell of wet soil. Once I had finished, I washed the small pan in the sink, the water cold but bearable, and I poured myself a small cup of water. As darkness deepened, I lit a lantern and sat at the table, trying to read, but my mind kept drifting to the forest. There was something about the shadows that pressed against the windows, moving slightly as if the wind carried more than leaves. I forced myself to focus on the pages, but I could hear a low, consistent sound outside, too rhythmic to be natural. It was soft at first, almost like tapping, but it seemed to grow slightly in volume over time. I told myself it was just a branch rubbing against the cabin, or an animal, maybe a raccoon or a deer, but I couldn't shake the sense that it was deliberate. Hours passed slowly. I checked my supplies again. Water, food, matches, flashlight, knife, everything in place. I tried to sleep, but the noises outside made it difficult. The tapping continued, sometimes accompanied by the faint scraping of what could have been claws against wood. I sat up in bed, straining my ears, watching the faint glow of the lantern. I didn't hear footsteps on the porch, but I couldn't be sure. Every little sound was amplified in the quiet. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I drifted into a fitful sleep. I woke suddenly in the night to a loud thump against the cabin. My heart raced. My first instinct was disbelief, but the sound repeated, hard, heavy, deliberate. I grabbed the flashlight and crept toward the door, careful to make as little noise as possible. Outside, everything was dark. The beam of my flashlight cut through the night, landing on trees and brush, nothing obvious. I circled the cabin slowly, the gravel crunching under my boots. There was no sign of anyone, no footprints beyond my own, no tire tracks on the dirt road leading here. Only the forest and the sounds of small animals moving. I tried to calm myself, telling myself I had probably hit a branch or a loose shutter. The next morning, I woke early, tired and restless. I had only gotten a few hours of sleep, but I forced myself to eat and clean up. I decided to go outside, needing sunlight and fresh air. The forest looked different in the day. Shadows disappeared, and everything seemed sharper, clearer. I walked a short distance from the cabin, listening to the sounds of birds and insects, trying to reset my mind. The dirt path leading to the cabin showed only my footprints and the occasional animal print, nothing human. I returned to the cabin, reassured, though a small part of me remained uneasy. The following day, I began exploring more of the surrounding area. The forest was dense and the trees thick, but I kept within a reasonable distance of the cabin. I noticed broken branches on the ground, small patches where the underbrush had been disturbed. Nothing alarming, maybe deer, maybe raccoons, but there was a pattern that felt deliberate. Each day I noticed more signs. Footprints that were not quite like animal tracks, slight depressions in the dirt, areas where the grass seemed flattened. I started carrying a knife whenever I left the cabin, just as a precaution. By the third night, the sounds outside the cabin had changed. The tapping had evolved into something heavier, louder. Occasionally, I could hear movement on the porch, the sound of wood shifting as if someone was leaning against it. I never saw anyone, but the sense of being watched grew unbearable. I stopped venturing far from the cabin, keeping to the small clearing around it. I reinforced the doors with anything I could find inside: chair legs, logs from the firewood pile, anything to create a barrier. I stayed up most of the night, scanning the darkness with the flashlight, waiting for something that never came. The fourth day, I realized I needed a plan. If someone or something was out there, I had to be prepared. I cleared a small area behind the cabin for a defensive position, stacking logs for protection. I organized all my supplies in one spot so I could access them quickly. I memorized every corner of the cabin, every window, every possible entry point. The forest felt alive in a way I couldn't explain, every sound amplified, every movement suspicious. The fifth day brought rain, heavy rain that pounded on the roof, ran in rivulets down the windows, and made the forest smell of wet earth. It should have been comforting, masking my presence, but it only intensified the isolation. The tapping had returned, louder and more persistent. I stayed inside, flashlight and knife at the ready, waiting out the storm. Hours passed like this, the rain drowning out all other sounds, yet somehow not enough. The tapping would stop when the rain hit the cabin and then start again, soft at first, then louder, as though the person or animal was testing my nerves. By the sixth day, I realized the stress was affecting me. I was paranoid, exhausted, jumpy at every small noise. I decided to focus on practical matters: food, water, firewood. I cleaned the cabin, swept the floors, organized the pantry. I marked a route through the forest, a small loop I could walk without straying too far. so I could get exercise without losing my bearings. The repeated routine. I remember the first time I saw the cabin, the way it stood alone in the forest, not part of any trail or park, as though it had been forgotten by time. I had driven for hours along a narrow, uneven road, gravel crunching under my tires, the trees thick on either side so that the sun barely reached the ground. The air smelled sharp, a mixture of pine and wet earth, and the distant hum of insects filled the spaces between the occasional rustle of leaves. I had planned this trip for months, a solo weekend away from the city to clear my head and write. The cabin was small, wooden, unpainted, the kind of place that seemed simple but sturdy, with a steep roof covered in moss and a porch that sagged slightly in the middle. I had no cell service out here, which was part of the reason I chose it, and I told myself that the isolation would help me focus. Inside, the cabin was cramped but functional. The air was musty, with the faint scent of old wood and dampness. A simple stove sat in the corner of the main room, a small table pushed against the wall, and a single chair. There was a bed in a tiny loft above, just enough space to lie down, and a fireplace that had clearly not been used in some time. I unpacked my things slowly, feeling a strange mix of excitement and unease. The isolation was both freeing and heavy, like the air itself was pressing down on me. The first night was quiet. I lit a small lantern and watched the shadows dance on the walls, feeling a faint chill creep over my skin. The wind pressed against the windows, rattling the panes just enough to make me pause and listen. Outside, the forest was alive with sound. The scraping of branches, the distant call of a bird, the occasional snap of a twig. I tried not to think about it too much, telling myself it was all normal. But there was a rhythm to the forest that felt like it was watching, listening, and I could feel it pressing closer as the night went on. The next day, I decided to explore the area around the cabin. There was no clear path, just a tangle of underbrush and trees. I walked for what felt like hours, careful with every step, listening to the way the forest shifted and moved around me. At first, it was exhilarating, the way the light fell through the branches, the sound of birdsong and running water somewhere in the distance. But as I went deeper, the sounds changed. The birds stopped, the wind died down, the forest became heavy, almost too still. And then I realized that I had lost track of where I had come from. The cabin was nowhere in sight. I could feel my heart start to race, and I forced myself to stop, to breathe, and to try to remember the way back. It wasn't easy. The forest all looked the same. Trees stretched endlessly, their trunks thick and close together, the underbrush tangled. I tried to mark my path, leaving scratches on bark, tossing small stones, anything to guide me back. The sun moved slowly, and I realized that I had been walking for far longer than I had thought. My stomach twisted in nervous energy, and I could feel the sweat forming on the back of my neck. There was a weight in the air, a heaviness, like the forest itself was holding its breath. Eventually, I stumbled upon a small stream, the water clear and cold, running over stones. I followed it, hoping it might lead me somewhere familiar, but it only seemed to wind deeper into the woods. By the time I finally found a faint path, it was late afternoon, and the light was already fading. I started to feel that cold, creeping fear that I had read about but never truly experienced. I was alone. I had no cell signal. The cabin, my one anchor, could be miles away, and I had no way of knowing which direction to go. I forced myself to stay calm, to think logically. I had packed a flashlight, food, water, a first aid kit, and a small hatchet. I could survive the night if I needed to, but I didn't want to. I wanted to get back to the cabin. I found a small clearing and decided to follow the remnants of an old trail I noticed, hoping it might connect to the path I had driven in on. The trail was overgrown, barely visible, but it gave me a point of focus. I walked slowly, carefully, listening for any sounds. The forest had changed again. Now there were new noises, low rustlings in the underbrush that I couldn't immediately identify. Every step made me jump. I could almost convince myself that there were eyes watching me from the darkness, even though I knew rationally that it was probably just animals. As the sun dipped below the horizon, I finally began to hear the faint sound of something familiar, the distant howl of a dog. My heart leapt. Could there be a house nearby? I pushed forward, keeping my eyes on the path, until finally I caught sight of the cabin through the thinning trees. Relief flooded through me, but it was tempered by exhaustion and a lingering edge of fear. I was safe, but the experience had changed something inside me. That night, I stayed inside the cabin, securing all doors and windows, keeping my lantern close. I could hear the forest outside, alive with movement, and I lay awake, thinking about how easily a wrong turn could have left me lost, alone, and without help. I realized how little control I truly had out here, how reliant I was on knowing my surroundings and on the fragile thread of luck. Over the next day, I explored the nearby area, but I stayed close to the cabin, making sure I had clear landmarks and paths. I found a small pile of firewood behind the cabin, and I cleared a line of brush around the perimeter to make it easier to see anything approaching. I found a shallow stream not far from the cabin and made mental notes of the terrain, marking trees and rocks that stood out. Each step I took was cautious and deliberate. I realized that survival here wasn't about bravery or strength. It was about attention, preparation, and patience. The second night was calmer. I sat on the porch as darkness fell, the sky a deep blue streaked with stars. The forest was quiet in a different way, more natural, more rhythmic. I could hear small animals rustling through the underbrush, owls calling, the wind shifting. It was still unsettling, but I felt more in control. I realized that fear, while powerful, could be managed. I could learn the rhythms of this place, and in doing so, I could exist safely within it. By the third day, I had mapped out small trails, made a fire pit, and stocked enough water and firewood for the remainder of my stay. Each day, I felt more confident, more aware of the forest's dangers and its patterns. I knew where to step to avoid twisting an ankle, where snakes might hide, which areas were safe to walk at night, and which places were best left alone. The fear that had gripped me on my first night had evolved into a careful respect, a recognition of the forest's power and my own vulnerability. When it was finally time to leave, I felt a strange mix of relief and melancholy. I had survived, and I had learned more about myself than I had expected. I packed my things carefully, checking every corner of the cabin to leave it as I had found it. I took one last look around, noting the small fire pit I had built, the cleared brush, the trail markers I had left, and the faint imprint of my passage in the soft earth. Driving away, I felt the tension slowly lift from my shoulders, but the lessons lingered. Isolation could be terrifying, but it also sharpened my senses, honed my awareness, and reminded me that survival relied not on fantasy or luck, but on preparation, patience, and respect for the environment. That weekend had been one of the most frightening experiences of my life, but also one of the most enlightening. I left the forest with a sense of accomplishment, a deeper understanding of fear, and a newfound respect for the fragile balance between humans and nature. I had been looking forward to the weekend in the cabin for months. I had found it through an online listing, tucked away in the mountains, far from the nearest town. The pictures showed a small log cabin surrounded by dense forest, a little lake not far away, and a dirt road that seemed almost impossible to reach without a proper vehicle. I had imagined it would be the perfect place to get away from everything, to be completely alone for a few days, and to enjoy silence in a way that the city could never give me. I had packed enough food and supplies to last a week, just to be safe, and had taken extra precautions. A first aid kit, plenty of bottled water, batteries, a gas-powered lantern, and a fully charged phone with a portable power bank. The road to the cabin was rough, but my small SUV handled it well enough. The closer I got, the more I noticed how completely isolated the area was. There were no other vehicles, no signs of houses, and the forest on either side of the dirt track was dense enough that sunlight barely reached the ground. By the time I arrived, the sun was low, casting long shadows across the trees. The cabin looked even smaller in real life than in the photos, but it had a certain rustic charm. It sat on a small clearing, surrounded by thick pines, and smoke from the chimney indicated that someone had been there recently, though it seemed empty now. I parked the car near the front and took a deep breath, enjoying the crisp mountain air. There was a certain calmness in the isolation, but a slight unease too. Being so far from anything, so far from people, made me realize just how alone I truly would be for the next few days. I shrugged it off, telling myself it was part of the experience. I grabbed my backpack with supplies, my lantern, and my small camping stove and made my way to the front door. The door was old and creaked as I pushed it open, revealing a small main room with a stone fireplace, a couple of wooden chairs, and a small table. Dust covered the surfaces and cobwebs hung in the corners, but overall the cabin looked solid. I dropped my pack near the table, set up my stove in the corner near the fireplace, and unpacked some of the food I had brought. I lit a small fire and watched the flames flicker, feeling a little more settled as the room warmed. Outside, the forest was darkening quickly, and the shadows seemed to stretch into the clearing. The first night was mostly uneventful. I ate a simple meal, cleaned up, and settled into the small bed. But the silence was heavier than I expected. In the city, there is always some background noise, cars, voices, machines, but out here there was nothing but the occasional rustle of leaves and the distant call of birds or small animals. At one point, I thought I heard footsteps outside, but when I strained my ears, the sound stopped. I convinced myself it had been my imagination or perhaps an animal moving near the cabin. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I tried to sleep, but every crack of a branch or distant sound made me jump. The next morning, I decided to explore the area around the cabin. I took a small map I had printed out and a flashlight, in case I wandered too far. The clearing around the cabin was bigger than it looked from the road, and the forest around it was thick, with tall pines and undergrowth that made moving quietly almost impossible. As I walked, I noticed signs of wildlife, small tracks, broken branches, and a few distant noises that I couldn't identify. I also noticed something else: faint tire tracks leading off the dirt road into the trees. They looked recent, not more than a few days old. My first thought was that someone else had been here recently. My stomach tightened slightly, but I told myself it wasn't dangerous. It was just another hiker or someone passing through. I returned to the cabin in the early afternoon and started preparing food. As I chopped vegetables, I kept glancing out the window at the forest. Something about the stillness made the hairs on my arms stand on end. By evening, I had lit the fireplace again, and the cabin was warm and cozy. I tried reading a book, but the tension of being completely alone made it hard to concentrate. I kept checking the windows, scanning the darkness outside, and every small noise made my heart race. I couldn't tell if it was animals, the wind, or something else entirely. I finally forced myself to eat and went to bed, setting the lantern on the small table next to me. The second night was worse. Around midnight, I woke to a loud thump outside. My heart jumped, and I froze, listening. The sound came again, closer this time, like something large moving through the underbrush. I grabbed the flashlight and slowly moved to the door, trying to stay quiet. Peering outside, I could see nothing but the darkness and the faint outlines of trees. I called out, though not expecting an answer, and the forest remained silent. I decided it might be a deer or a bear, and I quickly retreated back into the cabin. I knew bears were common in the area, and though I had read about them, I hadn't expected to feel this vulnerable. I made sure all the windows and doors were locked and spent the rest of the night awake, holding a long stick I had found outside near the porch. The following morning, I inspected the area around the cabin more closely. There were indeed bear tracks near the back of the clearing, large enough to confirm my fear. My unease grew, but I reassured myself that as long as I stayed inside and kept food secured, I would be safe. I spent the day cutting small pieces of wood for the fireplace, collecting water from a nearby stream, and generally preparing to stay isolated. Yet every small sound outside, the crack of a branch, a distant howl, made me flinch. By the third night, I was exhausted but also tense. I had become hyper-aware of every sound, every shadow, every shift of the wind. That night, I awoke to a different sound. Not a thump or a rustle, but a dragging noise, slow and deliberate, coming from the direction of the back of the cabin. My heart raced, and I slowly reached for my flashlight. I shone it outside, trying to see what could be making that sound. The beam caught movement, and I froze. There, moving carefully but deliberately among the trees, was a person. At first, I thought it must be another hiker, but their movements were deliberate and slow, almost as if they were searching for something. I stepped back, keeping quiet, my mind racing. Why would someone be here in the middle of the night, away from the road, in a cabin nobody else seemed to know about? I considered calling the police, but the cabin had almost no signal. I pulled out my phone anyway, and there was a single bar. I sent a brief text with my location, hoping someone could track it if needed. The person outside remained, moving closer to the cabin. I kept the flashlight off, hiding in the shadows. My mind ran through options. The nearest town was miles away, and if this person tried to break in, I was alone. I checked the cabin again, making sure the door was locked, and moved silently to the window to get a better view. They were crouched now, examining something on the ground, and I realized it was one of my food containers I had left outside temporarily. Relief mixed with anxiety as I realized they were scavenging. But why? Why would anyone come here, to this isolated cabin, in the middle of the night? I decided the only safe option was to wait. I stayed in the shadows, watching, until the person finally stood up and moved back toward the forest. I didn't hear them leave entirely, but the noise faded. My body was tense, my heart still racing, but I felt a small relief that I hadn't been discovered. I double-checked the locks and secured all my food inside. I stayed awake the rest of the night, holding the stick I had found earlier, every muscle in my body tight with fear. The next morning, I ventured outside carefully. Nothing had been disturbed, except for the food container. There were no tracks, no footprints that I could discern in the dirt, and no sign of who had been there. I realized how isolated I truly was. No one would pass by for hours, maybe days. The fear that had been building in me began to grow into a deep anxiety, a constant tension that made even simple tasks exhausting. Over the next 2 days, I focused on survival, collecting water, keeping the fire going, and rationing food. Each sound outside made me tense, each shadow seemed to move with intention, and I found myself unable to relax at all. I imagined what would happen if someone tried to break in, if a bear came, if I tripped or fell while exploring. The isolation was overwhelming. Yet, gradually, I began to regain some sense of control. I fortified the cabin as best I could, placing heavy furniture near the doors, keeping knives and sticks ready, and establishing a routine. On the 6th day, I decided it was time to leave. I packed all my supplies into the car, checking the road carefully. The tire tracks from earlier were still faintly visible, but there were no signs of recent movement. I started the SUV and drove cautiously down the rough dirt track, aware of how quickly things could go wrong in such isolation. The drive was tense, every shadow and sound making me nervous, but eventually, I reached the paved road leading toward town. By the time I pulled into a small convenience store in the nearest town, I felt a mix of relief and exhaustion I had never experienced. I stopped, took a deep breath, and realized how I had been driving for hours on the narrow, winding roads that led deep into the forest. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth and pine, and the only sound inside my old car was the hum of the engine and the occasional creak of the worn seats. My destination was a small, isolated cabin I had rented for a weekend getaway. The idea was simple: get away from the city, from people, from the constant pressure of work and life. I thought a quiet cabin in the woods would give me the peace I had been craving, a chance to reset. The sun was already low when I reached the dirt road that led to the cabin. The road was narrow and overgrown, with branches scraping against the sides of the car as I drove slowly forward. Every few meters, I had to dodge large rocks or deep ruts, the tires crunching over the uneven ground. I noticed that the forest was unusually quiet. No birds, no rustling of small animals. Not even the wind seemed to move through the dense canopy of trees. The quiet was unsettling, though I told myself it was just the late hour. The cabin finally appeared, tucked into a small clearing. It was modest, built from rough timber, with a steep roof and a stone chimney. The windows were small and grimy, reflecting the fading light in dull, dim flashes. A wooden porch ran along the front, and a stack of firewood was piled neatly against the side. The place looked untouched for a while, almost abandoned, but in a way that still felt livable. I parked the car at the edge of the clearing and got out, stretching my stiff back from the long drive. The air was colder than I expected, carrying a damp, almost metallic smell. As I approached the cabin, I noticed the ground around it was trampled, as if someone had walked there recently, though I had seen no other vehicles. I shrugged it off. Maybe it was a caretaker, or maybe the previous renters had left footprints that had not yet been covered. The door was heavy but opened without resistance. Inside, the cabin smelled of old wood and dust, but it was dry, and the walls were sturdy. The furniture was basic. A small wooden table, 2 chairs, a simple bed with a thin mattress, and a wood stove in the corner. There was a stack of newspapers from a few weeks ago on the table, which I found odd but ignored. I unpacked my things quickly, wanting to get settled before it became dark. The cabin had no electricity, no phone signal, and certainly no Wi-Fi. For some reason, the lack of connectivity made me feel both anxious and free. I lit a few candles and started a small fire in the stove. The flames cast flickering shadows on the walls, making the cabin feel smaller and somehow more vulnerable. I prepared a simple dinner from the supplies I had brought and tried to relax. Night came fast. The forest outside turned black, and the sounds of the day disappeared entirely. In their place was a deep, heavy silence. Occasionally, I heard the snap of a branch or the rustle of leaves, but it was impossible to tell how far away it was or what it was. I had read stories of wild animals in these woods, bears, mountain lions, even wolves, but I told myself that none of them would come near a human. I tried to sleep, but the darkness pressed on the windows, and every little noise made me tense. I eventually drifted into a restless, light sleep, aware of the faint outline of the moon through the tiny window. I woke in the middle of the night to the sound of something outside. At first, I thought it was the wind, though there had been no wind before. Then I realized it was a deliberate sound, the creak of wood under weight, faint but distinct. Someone, or something, was moving on the porch. My heart began to race. I stayed still, trying to tell myself it was a deer or a raccoon, but the sound continued, deliberate, slow, measured. Whoever it was not trying to hurry, just stepping carefully, almost methodically, across the porch. I stayed flat on my back, barely breathing. I watched the window as the shadows shifted slightly. The movement stopped abruptly, and then I heard it again. A low, dragging sound, like something heavy being pulled across the wood. My mind raced with possibilities, none of them comforting. I considered getting up, grabbing something for protection, but I knew the cabin had no lock strong enough to stop a determined intruder. My only real options were to hide or escape, and escaping meant stepping out into the unknown dark, surrounded by trees. Hours passed like this. Every sound made me jump. I could hear the faint rustle of leaves, the occasional crack of a branch underfoot. My candle burned low, and I didn't dare light another. I lay awake, my mind calculating every scenario, every possible outcome. I remembered the stack of newspapers on the table and realized the last person there could have left them years ago. Maybe it wasn't someone living nearby. Maybe it was just a transient passing through. Or maybe it was something worse, someone watching, waiting. By dawn, the sounds had stopped. The forest was awakening slowly, birds beginning to call, squirrels rustling through the underbrush. I could see more clearly outside, and everything seemed normal. No footprints, no disturbances, nothing to indicate that someone had been there. I tried to convince myself I had imagined it, that the darkness had played tricks on my mind. But a part of me refused to believe that. Not after the sounds, not after the deliberate steps on the porch. I spent the next day on edge, inspecting the cabin, checking the windows and doors. Everything was intact. I walked the perimeter, noting that the surrounding forest was thick and easy to hide in, with numerous paths that someone could take without being seen from the main road. My rational mind kept telling me that no one would bother with this isolated cabin, but my instincts screamed otherwise. I stocked the firewood inside, moved the table to block the door, and even cleared the porch so I could see if anyone approached. I carried a heavy metal poker from the stove for protection, though the thought of actually using it filled me with dread. The second night was worse. I lay in bed, listening, eyes wide open. Around midnight, I heard it again, the dragging, deliberate steps. But this time, I could hear something else. A faint, rhythmic tapping, like fingers drumming on the wooden railing. The sound came closer to the window, and I realized it was outside, right at the edge of the porch. My heart pounded. I grabbed the poker and moved toward the nearest window, peeking out just enough to see. A shadow shifted near the edge of the clearing, tall, indistinct, and impossible to identify. It didn't move further into the clearing. It seemed to wait. I stayed frozen for what felt like hours. Eventually, the figure retreated into the forest, slow and deliberate, disappearing into the darkness. I could hear it moving among the trees, breaking branches, rustling leaves. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night, sitting by the stove with the poker in hand, listening to every sound. By dawn, the forest was quiet again, as if nothing had happened. I knew then that staying was no longer safe. I packed my essentials and prepared to leave, but the thought of driving that road in daylight, alone, through dense forest, made me uneasy. I had no idea if whoever had been watching was still nearby. I decided to wait until the afternoon, hoping that enough light would give me a safer path out. During the morning, I considered all my options. I could hike out, follow the river downstream, but I had no map and no knowledge of the terrain. Driving was still risky, but I could at least move faster. I loaded the car carefully, leaving nothing outside that could give me away. I kept the poker on the passenger seat, my eyes constantly scanning the treeline as I drove slowly toward the main road. As I reached the dirt road, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. Fresh tire tracks parallel to mine, coming from the cabin. They were too recent to be old. Someone had followed me, or maybe had left after I had noticed them in the night. I pushed the car faster, every sound from the forest setting me on edge. Branches scraped against the sides, leaves slapped the windshield, and I had to swerve around fallen logs. The road seemed endless, but eventually, I saw the first signs of civilization. The paved road, the highway, a passing car. Relief washed over me, though I kept driving without stopping until I reached a small town an hour away. I reported the incident to the local authorities, who promised to check the cabin, though I knew they might find nothing. The area was remote, and it was easy for someone to vanish into the forest without a trace. Still, knowing that someone else would investigate gave me some sense of closure. I stayed the night in a motel, constantly checking the locks, and by the next day, I began to feel the first real sense of relief. Weeks later, I returned to the city, but the memory of those nights stayed with me. I realized that the forest, so beautiful and serene in daylight, could hide dangers that were not immediately visible. I never went back to that cabin, never took another isolated trip, and always carried a sense of caution and awareness when I ventured into unfamiliar, secluded areas. The experience taught me the value of preparation, of trusting instincts, and of understanding that isolation in nature can sometimes be as threatening as anything else in life. Eventually, I learned that someone had indeed been living illegally in that forest, moving. I had been driving for hours, the endless stretch of winding roads through the dense forest slowly sapping my energy, yet something about the isolation had always drawn me to it. The cabin I rented was advertised as remote, off the grid, a true retreat from the constant noise of the city. I didn't expect, though, how suffocatingly quiet it would be. By the time I turned off the last dirt road, the sky was bleeding into dusk, casting the treetops in long, black shadows. I parked my car near the cabin, its headlights barely illuminating the uneven ground. The smell of wet pine and decaying leaves filled the air, thick and earthy, mingling with the faint smoke of a chimney from a distant, unseen neighbor. The cabin itself was small, made of aged logs that had darkened over decades, the wood warped slightly from weather and age. The roof sagged in one corner, and the windows were clouded with years of dust. I carried my bag inside, the creaking of the floorboards echoing in the empty space. The air inside smelled of old wood, dust, and something faintly metallic, like iron or old water pipes. I set my things down on the table and ran my hands along the counter, noticing how rough and uneven the surface was. The cabin was fully furnished in a bare, utilitarian way. A small bed with a thin mattress, a wood-burning stove, a few shelves with books that seemed decades out of date, and a table and chair that had obviously seen far more use than they deserved. As the sky outside turned to a deep, inky blue, I decided to check the surroundings. I stepped outside and walked a short way into the forest, using the fading light to guide me. The trees were close together, and the underbrush was thick, making every step uncertain. I could hear the wind brushing through the branches, a low, constant whisper, and every now and then the sharp snap of a branch breaking under its own weight. Something about the way the shadows moved in the corner of my eye made me tense, though I told myself it was just my imagination. Still, there was a certain weight to the forest, a presence that didn't feel alive but wasn't entirely lifeless either. Returning to the cabin, I started a fire in the wood stove, the crackling flames illuminating the interior in flickering, warm light. I unpacked a few things and prepared a simple meal from the supplies I had brought. As the darkness pressed in through the windows, the forest outside seemed denser, more menacing. Every rustle, every snap of a branch made me flinch. I thought about locking the door, but the cabin had an old, wooden latch, not a lock in the modern sense. I set a chair against it anyway, trying to convince myself it was enough. Night fell fully, and with it came an almost physical sense of solitude. The wind picked up outside, and I could hear it whistling through the cracks in the logs, making the walls groan and the roof shake slightly. I lay on the thin mattress, staring at the ceiling, the sound of the forest pressing against the cabin's fragile walls. Then I heard it, a scraping sound at the edge of the cabin, slow and deliberate. My heart jumped. I held my breath, straining to hear, but the sound stopped as suddenly as it began. I told myself it was an animal, maybe a raccoon or a deer, but even as I tried to rationalize it, the unease in my stomach refused to fade. I decided to check outside, convincing myself I needed to know what was there. I grabbed a flashlight, the beam cutting a narrow path through the darkness. The scraping had left no sign at the door, but as I moved around the cabin, I noticed deep, irregular scratches along the lower part of the logs. The wood was gouged as if something strong and persistent had tried to get in. My stomach twisted. Whatever it wasn't small. I went back inside, heart hammering, and secured the door as best I could. Sleep didn't come easily that night. Every noise, the wind, the branches, even the settling of the wood, made me flinch. Morning brought light, but not relief. The scratches were worse than I remembered, extending along the side of the cabin. I walked the perimeter, trying to understand what could have done it. Nothing moved. No footprints in the soft dirt around the cabin. Only the marks. I examined them carefully, the splintered wood suggesting immense strength. Yet I couldn't see how any animal could have left them without leaving other signs. I tried to rationalize, telling myself maybe it was a bear that had clawed at the wood in a fit of frustration. But even that seemed off. The marks didn't follow any natural pattern. That day, I stayed inside, keeping the door locked, peering through the dusty windows at the forest, watching for movement. The isolation felt heavier than ever, oppressive, like the trees themselves were leaning in closer, watching. I noticed small things, the way shadows pooled in corners, how the floor creaked in patterns I hadn't heard before, the sudden cold patches near the windows. I tried to stay busy, chopping firewood, cleaning, preparing meals, but the tension never lifted. Every sound outside, every rustle in the underbrush, made me freeze. I caught myself imagining shapes moving between the trees, tall, human-like, silent. By the second night, the fear had become almost physical. I couldn't sleep more than a few minutes at a time, waking to every creak, every sound amplified by the stillness. Around midnight, I heard it again, this time more deliberate. A soft thump followed by dragging sounds along the side of the cabin. I held my breath, frozen, straining to hear. The dragging continued, slow and methodical, then stopped. I couldn't see anything through the windows. The forest seemed utterly still. I stayed awake until dawn, too afraid to close my eyes. Morning didn't bring comfort, only a new set of discoveries. The side of the cabin had fresh marks, deeper now, gouges in the wood that hadn't been there before. They were concentrated around the windows, like something had tried to pry them open. My stomach churned, my mind spinning through scenarios, none of them comforting. I couldn't tell if I was dealing with an animal or something else. I considered leaving, but the nearest road was miles away, and I couldn't risk walking through the forest alone with whatever had been outside. I spent the next day preparing. I reinforced the doors and windows as best I could, stacking heavy furniture against them, nailing boards across weak points. I kept the fire going in the stove to maintain warmth, though the smoke made the cabin thick and difficult to breathe. I rationed food and water carefully. Outside, I saw no movement during the day, but the silence felt unnatural, as if the forest was holding its breath, waiting. Night came again, darker than the last, with a storm rolling in. Rain lashed against the roof, wind bending the trees, and the sounds outside were terrifying in their randomness: branches cracking, debris hitting the cabin, the scraping and thumping returning. I stayed in a corner of the room, clutching a heavy kitchen knife, listening. Hours passed, the storm raging around me. Occasionally, I could hear something moving in the mud outside, slow, deliberate, dragging sounds that made my stomach knot with fear. I barely slept, only dozing for short stretches, waking to the sound of splintered wood and my own shallow breathing. By the third day, exhaustion and fear had worn me down. My mind felt raw, alert to every minute sound. I realized I needed a plan. I could stay barricaded inside, but I couldn't survive indefinitely without leaving. The rain had stopped, leaving the forest saturated, muddy. I decided to wait until midday, when the light was strongest, and make a run for the car. I prepared everything carefully, packed a small bag, placed the heaviest knife in my belt, and waited, listening. When I finally stepped outside, my heart nearly stopped. The forest was eerily still, the aftermath of the storm leaving branches broken and leaves strewn across the ground. But the worst was the tracks. Deep, wide imprints surrounding the cabin. They weren't human, not exactly, but large, like a bear's. And they followed me, circling the cabin, moving into the forest whenever I tried to follow them. I swallowed hard, adrenaline pumping, and ran for the car, not daring to look back. Every step through the mud and debris felt dangerous, the forest oppressive, like it was closing in. I reached the car, hands trembling, mud splattered across my clothes. I jumped in, locked the doors, and started the engine. The tracks continued to appear at the edge of the clearing, always just out of reach, always there when I glanced in the rearview mirror. I didn't stop until I reached the main road, heart still hammering, sweat and rain mingling on my face. I drove for hours, the memory of the cabin and the forest etched in my mind. Eventually, I stopped at a gas station, still shaking, my body refusing to relax. I realized how close I had come to being trapped, possibly attacked. The police told me later that the area had wild animals, and some had grown aggressive near human settlements, but nothing matched exactly what I had seen. I didn't go back. I never wanted to. Even now, I can't forget it. The way the forest seemed alive with quiet menace, the scratches on the cabin, the dragging sounds at night, and the feeling of being watched, hunted, by something impossibly strong and patient. I remember the relief when I finally left the woods, the sun. I had been looking forward to a solo trip to the cabin for weeks. It wasn't far from the city, just a few hours' drive into the mountains, but far enough that the world I knew, my phone, my neighbors, the hum of traffic, would vanish behind thick pine forests and the rough curves of a mountain road. The cabin itself had been empty for years, rented out only occasionally, and that appealed to me. I liked quiet. I liked isolation. I liked feeling the weight of nature pressing in on all sides, knowing it was indifferent to me, and yet somehow comforting. I had driven there in the late morning, the sun bright in the sky, the temperature still mild for early autumn. The air smelled like wet soil and pine, and the closer I got, the louder the wind seemed to get, rustling through the branches like it was whispering something just out of reach. When I finally arrived, the cabin looked smaller than I had imagined from the pictures online. It was a rough log structure, weathered gray with age, but solid, sitting in a small clearing surrounded by trees. Smoke still curled from the chimney, a small wisp barely visible against the sky, which told me someone had been here not long before me. The driveway was unkempt, strewn with leaves and small branches, and the wood steps creaked as I climbed onto the small porch. I carried my backpack, a bundle of supplies, and the familiar sense of expectation began to settle in, the way it always did when I entered a space that I had made my own for even a short while. Inside, the cabin was rustic, stripped back to the bare necessities. A small kitchen was tucked into the corner, a wood stove and sink, cupboards with old plates and pans. The main room had a simple table and chairs, and a couch with a threadbare cover. The smell of damp wood was strong, a mix of mildew and smoke. I dropped my backpack near the door and began to inspect the place. Windows were dusty, and I ran my hand across the glass, smudging it. The view outside was dense forest, trees swaying in the wind, their shadows stretching long and dark as the afternoon sun shifted. I unpacked, putting food into the small fridge and water into a jug. I lit the stove to warm the room and sat back in the chair by the window. The cabin was silent except for the wind and the occasional creak of the logs as they settled. I could hear birds, too, and the rustle of small animals moving through the underbrush outside. It was peaceful, almost too peaceful. There was nothing to do but sit, watch, and wait, and I welcomed that. As night approached, I built a fire in the wood stove. The flames crackled and spat, the room warming quickly, and the shadows on the walls stretched and danced. I ate a simple dinner, just some bread, cheese, and canned beans, and washed it down with water. Outside, the sky darkened to a deep, inky blue, and the wind picked up, pushing against the cabin walls, making them groan. The forest around me seemed to grow heavier, thicker, as if the trees themselves were leaning closer. I was aware of every small noise, the crack of a branch, the flapping of wings, the distant scrape of rocks shifting somewhere unseen. My first night in a cabin like this always carried a weight, a small tightness in my chest that told me to be alert, even though nothing was wrong. Sleep was fitful. The bed was hard, the blankets thin. Every sound outside seemed exaggerated. The creak of the porch in the wind, the skittering of some animal across the roof, the occasional sharp snap of a branch breaking in the dark. I kept my flashlight on the nightstand, my phone charged, my backpack by the bed with essentials ready. At some point, I dozed off, though lightly, and when I woke, the room was dark and cold, the fire reduced to glowing embers. The next morning, I stepped outside to stretch my legs. The wind had died down, leaving only the soft sounds of the forest. Sunlight filtered through the branches, highlighting patches of frost on the grass and leaves. I explored the area around the cabin, noting a small creek nearby and a trail that led further into the woods. The isolation felt good during the day. I could hear nothing but the forest and the water, and it was easy to lose the sense of time. I spent the day chopping wood, cleaning up the cabin, and preparing for the next night, stocking extra kindling and food. The second night brought a change. The wind returned, stronger now, rattling the windows, making the trees bend and sway with a force that pressed against the walls. I could hear something moving outside, too large to be a small animal. My first thought was a deer, then a bear, and I reminded myself that bears were common in the area, especially this time of year. I made sure the doors were locked and that my supplies were within reach. I checked the windows, they were all latched. I fed the fire, building it higher than the night before. Around midnight, I heard it, a low, steady crunching outside, as if someone or something was walking in the underbrush, moving with purpose, not the erratic scurrying of a small creature. My heart rate spiked. I stayed still, listening, trying to tell how close it was. The sound moved slowly, circling the cabin, pausing at points, then continuing. My mind ran through possibilities, all realistic, wild animal, hiker, thief, but the forest was dense, and no path led directly to the cabin. Whoever, or whatever it was, they had come off trail. I grabbed my flashlight and a heavy cast iron pan from the stove, the only thing nearby that could serve as a weapon. The air outside smelled of wet leaves and something musky, hard to place. I shone the flashlight through the window, sweeping the beam across the dark tree line. Shadows shifted, and the beam caught a glimpse of movement. A large figure, hunched slightly, moving with an awkward gait. Not human. I froze. My first thought was bear, but the way it moved didn't match what I knew of bears. It circled again, staying just at the edge of visibility, staying in the dark. I retreated from the window, knowing I couldn't see it clearly and that stepping outside could be dangerous. I closed the blinds and sat back against the wall, heart hammering, listening. The noises continued for what felt like hours. Scraping, shifting, a low guttural sound at intervals. I kept reminding myself to stay calm. I had a fire, I had light, I had supplies. No matter what was out there, I was inside, and the cabin was solid. The wind shifted, and with it, the noises seemed to retreat, moving farther into the forest. I stayed awake the rest of the night, checking the windows, listening to every sound, every snap and rustle. Dawn eventually came, weak and gray, the sun struggling to pierce the morning fog. When I finally forced myself to step outside, the forest seemed calm again, though the underbrush showed signs of disturbance, broken branches, crushed leaves, indentations in the dirt that could only have been made by something heavy. I spent the day moving cautiously, never straying far from the cabin. I considered leaving, but the nearest town was a 2-hour drive back along the winding mountain road. I had enough supplies for another day, and I decided to wait and see if the disturbances were a one-time event. That night, I took no chances. I piled wood against the doors, secured the windows as best as I could, and kept a watchful eye out from behind the blinds. The wind returned, fierce again, rattling the structure. I stayed alert, sitting close to the fire, ready for whatever came. Hours passed, and eventually, I realized the noises outside had faded. By the early morning, silence returned to the forest, deep and complete. I waited a while longer before daring to step outside. The ground showed fresh tracks, deep and wide, clearly not human. But there was no sign of further intrusion. I examined the area, noting every detail, the broken branches, the flattened grass, the scuff marks on the cabin steps. But there was no clear threat now, only evidence that something large had been near. I packed my things, cleaned up the cabin, and left by mid-morning, keeping a careful watch on the surroundings as I walked to my car. The drive back was quiet, the mountains gradually giving way to familiar roads and towns. By the time I returned to the city, the tension had eased, though the memory of the cabin, the noises, and the heavy presence in the woods stayed with me. I realized that sometimes the scariest moments weren't the ones that involved monsters or ghosts, but the ones where you knew you were truly alone, surrounded by forces you couldn't control or fully understand, facing danger that was real and immediate. In the end, the experience left me with a strange mix of relief and respect. I survived, unharmed, but I had also learned the weight of solitude in the wilderness, the reality of being entirely at the mercy of the natural world and whatever moved quietly within it. I returned home safely, unpacked, and slept deeply that night, grateful for the warmth of civilization, the certainty of my surroundings, and the knowledge that while the forest had tested me, I had emerged intact. The cabin still stands, I know, and I would never forget the shadowed night I spent there, the sound of heavy steps outside, and the realization that sometimes the most terrifying things are entirely real and entirely human or animal, but no less dangerous. I never thought a weekend alone in a cabin could change the way I felt about isolation, but that weekend in late October did exactly that. I had found the cabin through an online rental listing. It was remote, tucked deep into the forest on the edge of a small state park. The description made it sound perfect, rustic but cozy, secluded, perfect for hiking, and disconnect from the world. I liked the idea of disconnecting, of being somewhere I could hear only the wind and the rustle of trees. The pictures showed a small log cabin with a chimney, a porch, and windows that reflected the surrounding pine forest. I didn't think twice about how remote it was, how far it was from the nearest town, or how alone I would be. I was eager to get away from everything, and the idea of total solitude sounded peaceful. The drive there was long, almost unbearably so. I left the city early in the morning, before sunrise, and the roads were empty. I passed small towns that looked like they had not changed in decades, with faded paint on wooden buildings and gas stations that seemed permanently closed. The GPS directed me onto a series of gravel roads that grew narrower and rougher the further I went. By the time I reached the last turnoff, the road had disappeared into a single-lane dirt path with deep ruts. My car bumped over rocks, and branches scraped the sides. The forest had closed in completely. The trees on either side were so close that they almost formed a tunnel. The sun was beginning to dip behind the horizon when I finally spotted the cabin. It looked exactly like the pictures, maybe even better in person. There was a faint smell of pine in the air, sharp and almost sweet. The porch creaked under my weight as I stepped out of the car. I carried my backpack inside, which was mostly food, clothes, and my laptop. I had intended to do some writing, maybe read a little, and generally enjoy being away from people. The inside was small but tidy. A main room with a small wood stove, a table, a few chairs, and a bed in the corner. A kitchenette had a sink and a tiny counter, and there was a bathroom with a shower. I unpacked quickly, feeling the relief of leaving the road behind me. By the time I had settled in, it was nearly dark. I lit the stove and prepared a simple dinner. I had brought pasta and canned sauce, nothing fancy, but it was enough. As I ate, I listened to the forest. It was quiet, but there was an underlying hum. The sound of leaves moving in the wind, twigs snapping somewhere beyond the windows, and distant calls of birds settling in for the night. I assumed these sounds were natural. I told myself that isolation was meant to make you notice things you usually ignore. After dinner, I cleaned up, washed the dishes in the small sink, and sat down by the stove with a blanket. I had brought a flashlight and a few candles, though I didn't light them yet. I liked the darkness at first, the way the shadows moved across the walls. I imagined that the forest stretched endlessly beyond the cabin, uninterrupted. I fell asleep relatively early, but the night was not restful. I woke up once or twice to the sound of branches brushing against the windows. At first, I thought it was the wind, but one time, I was certain I heard something more deliberate. A footstep on the porch. I froze, straining my ears. Nothing. The wind again? I shook my head and went back to sleep, convincing myself it was only imagination. The next day, I woke to gray skies and a light drizzle. I had intended to hike a nearby trail that was supposed to lead to a small waterfall. I packed a small bag with water, snacks, and a first aid kit and set out. The trail was muddy and uneven, slippery from the rain. I slipped a few times and had to stop to rest on fallen logs. It was peaceful at first, the forest alive with rain smells and the sound of water dripping from leaves. But after an hour, I began to feel uneasy. The forest was quieter than it should have been. Birds were silent, and even the constant drip of rain seemed to have slowed. The trail forked, and I realized I had missed the turn to the waterfall. I had no map, and my GPS signal was weak. I backtracked, but the trail began to feel unfamiliar, and I started to notice small things. Broken branches, depressions in the mud that looked like footprints, and discarded pieces of trash. Someone had been here recently. That wasn't unusual, but something about it made my stomach tighten. By late afternoon, the drizzle had stopped, but the forest was damp and cold. I decided to return to the cabin, but I couldn't remember the exact way. The trail looked the same in every direction, and the forest, which had seemed vast and comforting, now felt confining. Every rustle made me turn my head. I started walking faster, trying to recognize landmarks, but the trees all looked the same. After an hour of walking, my heart began to pound. I realized I might be lost. My phone still had no signal. I considered staying put and waiting, but I knew the cabin wasn't far in some direction, though I didn't know which. Eventually, I stumbled onto a small clearing. I stopped to catch my breath and tried to get my bearings. Then I noticed something that made my skin crawl. The ground in the clearing had several sets of footprints. They weren't my own, and they were recent. The mud was soft, and the prints had not been there long. Some of them led toward the trees, others in the direction I had come from. I had no idea what had left them, but the thought of someone else being in the forest, unknown and near, made my pulse spike. I didn't hear anything, but the feeling of being watched was almost overwhelming. I forced myself to keep moving, trying to put distance between myself and the prints. I eventually recognized a fallen tree I had passed earlier that morning. Relief washed over me. I was heading back to the cabin. I walked as fast as I dared, my eyes darting to every shadow. When I finally saw the familiar outline of the cabin in the distance, I let out a shaky breath. The front porch was empty, and the cabin looked unchanged. I unlocked the door, stepped inside, and locked it behind me. I checked every window. Everything seemed normal. I told myself I was overreacting. Someone else could be hiking, too. Maybe the footprints weren't even human. My heart slowed, slightly. I spent the rest of the evening securing the cabin as best I could. I closed all windows, checked the locks, and even placed a chair under the doorknob for extra security. I kept the stove lit for warmth and comfort. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, though. Every creak of the cabin, every gust of wind made me tense. I stayed up late, staring out the windows, listening for anything unusual. Eventually, exhaustion overtook fear, and I fell asleep again. That night was worse. I woke in the middle of it to the sound of something scraping against the cabin walls. My heart raced. The sound moved from one side of the cabin to the other, slow and deliberate. It wasn't the wind this time. I grabbed my flashlight, my hands shaking. I wanted to check outside, to see what it was, but I was afraid. I could hear the rain starting again outside. I sat in the middle of the room, flashlight on, trying to calm myself. Eventually, the noise stopped. I didn't sleep again for the rest of the night, lying in bed with the flashlight trained on the door. In the morning, the rain had stopped, and the forest looked deceptively calm. I decided I couldn't stay another night. I packed my things quickly, trying not to make any noise. I left the cabin exactly as it was, locking the door behind me. I took a different route this time, one I thought might be closer to the road. The forest was still dense, but I moved as quickly and quietly as I could, constantly listening. I imagined someone following me, though I saw no one. I slipped and fell several times, mud and leaves coating my hands and legs. The forest seemed endless, but eventually, I saw the faint outline of a road cutting through the trees. Relief flooded me. I ran the last few meters until I was standing on solid pavement. The drive back to civilization was tense. I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone following. I didn't. By the time I reached the nearest town, the unease had begun to fade. I stopped at a diner for a coffee, still shaking, still replaying the previous 2 days in my mind. I told myself I had imagined most of it, but the footprints, the noises, the feeling of being watched, all of it felt real. I couldn't explain it, but I didn't need to. I had survived, and that was enough. Weeks later, I thought about returning to the cabin, to try again in a calmer, safer time, but I never did. The memory of the forest, the feeling of being trapped, and the uncertainty of who or what might be out there stayed with me. I realized then that isolation can be deceptively dangerous, even without anyone intending harm. The forest is beautiful, but it is not forgiving. It does not care about your plans or your intentions. It simply is, and when you are alone in it, it can make even small things feel terrifying. Eventually, I moved on from the fear, though I never forgot it. I returned to the city, to familiar streets, noise, and light. The memory of the cabin became something I carried with me like a warning, a reminder of the vulnerability that comes with isolation. I never went back to that forest, but I learned to respect it in a way I never. I had planned the trip to the cabin for months, meticulously preparing every detail, thinking that if I could control everything, then nothing could go wrong. The cabin itself was far away, deep in the woods, about 2 hours from the nearest town. It was a small, old structure, built decades ago, with a narrow porch and a slanted roof that sagged in the middle. The paint had mostly peeled off, leaving the wood gray and weathered, but it was solid, and the isolation was exactly what I wanted. I wanted to be alone, away from the noise of phones, people, and responsibilities, to clear my mind and just exist without distractions. I left the city early in the morning, the sun barely above the horizon, casting a cold light over the roads. The drive was long, winding through hills and forests that grew denser the further I went. Each mile felt like I was entering another world, one that existed outside the reach of civilization. By the time I arrived at the dirt road leading to the cabin, the air smelled different, cleaner, damp, and a little sharp with the scent of pine and moss. The road itself was rough, lined with overgrown shrubs and rocks that jutted up unexpectedly. I had to drive slowly, careful not to scrape the underside of my car or get stuck. When I finally reached the cabin, the sun had climbed a bit higher, but the forest still kept shadows across the clearing. The cabin looked even smaller and more isolated than I had imagined, sitting like an afterthought among towering pines. There was a small pile of firewood stacked against the side and a rusted metal bucket near the porch. I stepped out, feeling the crunch of leaves and dirt under my boots, and took a deep breath. The silence was heavy, almost tangible, but not peaceful. There was an edge to it, a quiet that made me hyper-aware of every sound. The creak of the roof as the wind moved, the soft rustle of leaves, the distant caw of a crow. I started unloading my things: backpack, cooler, and a small duffel with essentials. Inside, I had packed food, water, batteries, candles, a first aid kit, a few blankets, and a small generator I hoped I wouldn't need. The plan was simple: spend a week alone, hike during the day, read, write, sleep early, and enjoy the quiet. I didn't realize yet how quickly simple could turn complicated. Inside, the cabin smelled of dust and wood, faintly musty, with traces of mold in the corners. The floorboards creaked under my weight. There was a small living area with a table and 2 chairs, a tiny kitchenette with a sink and a gas stove, and a loft bedroom above, accessible by a narrow ladder. The windows were small, single-paned, and offered a view of the surrounding forest. I set up my things carefully, stacking my supplies in one corner, laying out blankets on the bed, and lighting a few candles to chase away the shadows that seemed unnaturally dark inside. By mid-afternoon, I decided to explore the area. The forest stretched thick and endless in every direction, and I followed a narrow path that seemed to wind toward a small creek I remembered from the map. The air was cool, and the smell of damp earth was strong. As I walked, I noticed signs of wildlife, broken branches, small tracks in the mud, and distant calls of animals I couldn't identify. Nothing felt immediately dangerous, but a constant tension built as I realized just how alone I was. Even birds seemed cautious, their songs few and far between. By the time I returned to the cabin, my legs were tired, and the sun had dipped low, casting long shadows across the clearing. I set about building a fire in the small stone fireplace, the only source of warmth I would have once the sun set. The logs cracked and hissed as the flames grew, the light dancing across the walls and ceiling. I made a simple dinner of canned beans and bread and sat in the flickering light, trying to relax. Yet, every snap of the fire, every shift of the wind outside made me flinch. The forest was not silent. It was alive in ways I couldn't fully understand. That first night, I slept lightly, waking often to strange sounds. The scraping of branches against the roof, distant knocks that could have been animals or something else entirely, footsteps that I convinced myself were my own imagination. The darkness outside the windows was absolute, a wall of black that seemed to press in on the cabin. I realized that being alone in a place like this wasn't peaceful. It was a test of nerves, patience, and perception. The next day, I decided to hike further, following the creek upstream. The path was rough, often disappearing entirely into underbrush, forcing me to push branches aside and step over fallen logs. I felt the weight of isolation more acutely, the realization that if I injured myself, no one would know for hours, maybe even a full day. The creek itself was narrow, the water cold and clear, reflecting the sky through breaks in the canopy. I followed it as far as I could, but eventually, the terrain became too steep and slippery. I marked the location in my memory for a return later and headed back. As night fell again, I found myself unusually alert. I had learned to notice every detail: the way shadows moved, the sudden silence of birds, the subtle rustle of something larger moving just out of sight. It was the kind of attention that gnaws at your mind over time. By the third night, I was eating less, sleeping less, and imagining things I wasn't sure were real. A shadow flicking across the wall, a branch tapping against the window, the unmistakable sound of footsteps circling the cabin. I tried to rationalize everything: deer, raccoons, the wind. But rationalizing doesn't make the fear stop. One evening, as I was preparing to light the fire, I noticed something unusual. The front door, which I had locked carefully each night, was slightly ajar. My heart raced. I remembered locking it myself, and the lock had been simple but reliable. I checked the cabin, every corner, under the bed, in the loft, but no one was there. The food was untouched. My supplies were in place. Nothing was missing. The door hadn't been forced, just open, as if someone, or something, had simply entered and left without disturbing anything else. I spent hours checking the windows, barricading the door with a chair, and sitting close to the fire, my nerves raw. Sleep became impossible. The sounds of the forest grew louder, closer. Every step outside, every gust of wind, every small snapping sound made me jump. I realized that my isolation, once a comfort, had become a trap, amplifying every instinct I had. The next morning, I decided I couldn't stay in the cabin anymore without understanding what was happening. I packed essentials, leaving behind anything I didn't need to move quickly, and planned a careful route back to the main road. The forest seemed different in daylight, but the path was still treacherous. Rocks shifted under my feet, roots caught my boots, and the underbrush snagged my clothes. I moved slowly, constantly scanning, aware that my imagination had been sharpened into something like instinct. As I walked, I noticed subtle signs that made my pulse quicken. Footprints that weren't mine, too large, with a stride that suggested a heavier person, crisscrossed the paths I had marked. Broken branches at unusual heights suggested someone had been moving through the woods quickly. And there were small piles of stones, deliberately stacked, almost like markers. My fear was real now, grounded in evidence, not imagination. I pressed on, adrenaline keeping me moving. I avoided open clearings, sticking to the shadows, moving quietly, listening. Hours later, exhausted, scratched, and bleeding from minor cuts, I finally reached the point where the dirt road began. The sun was low in the sky, but I could see the familiar tire tracks leading back to civilization. I ran the final stretch, my legs aching, my lungs burning, until I reached my car. Once inside, I locked the doors, checked the back seat, and breathed deeply. The road back to the city felt like an escape from a trap I had only barely understood. The forest behind me was silent, indifferent. I drove carefully, constantly looking in the mirrors, expecting to see someone or something following, but nothing came. By nightfall, I was back on paved roads, surrounded by other cars, lights, and people. The world of the forest, the cabin, the isolation, was behind me. In the days that followed, I unpacked, cleaned minor scratches, and tried to return to normal life. I told myself the cabin had been an experiment, a test of endurance. The fear I experienced was real, but it was grounded in logic and circumstance. No ghosts, no monsters, just human instinct, isolation, and the vast unknown of the forest. The experience stayed with me, a reminder that sometimes the scariest thing isn't what's out there, but how small and unprepared you feel when the world around you refuses to conform to your expectations. In the end, I realized that fear has value. It teaches caution, vigilance, and humility. I never returned to the cabin, but I never regretted the trip. I learned the limits of my courage and the importance of preparation. And while I occasionally think of the footprints and the small piles of stones, I understand them as a part of the world. I had always been drawn to the quiet of the woods, the kind of silence that feels like a thick blanket pressing down on you, isolating you from the world in a way that's both soothing and a little unnerving. I grew up in a busy city where the noise never stopped: cars, people, neon signs buzzing, distant sirens, construction, everything merging into a dull roar that never let your mind settle. When I found out about the cabin, I saw it as an escape, a place to breathe, think, and for a few days, disappear. It was advertised as remote, completely off-grid, and it sat deep in the northern forests, miles away from the nearest road. The owner's website described it as rustic, cozy, and untouched by modern life. I liked the sound of untouched. I drove for hours, watching the landscape change from suburban sprawl to endless stretches of trees. The sun was lowering as I navigated a dirt road that had grown over in patches with grass and small saplings. I remember thinking about the isolation, about how if something went wrong out here, there would be no one for miles. But I told myself I was careful, prepared. I had a fully charged phone, extra batteries, a small first aid kit, food, water, and a satellite communication device in case of emergency. Still, as the car rattled over rocks and dips, I felt the first prickling of unease. There was something about the way the forest loomed, the way the trees crowded the narrow road, bending slightly over the path like they were watching me pass. When I finally saw the cabin, I was relieved and a little awestruck. It was a small log structure, weathered but solid. Smoke curled from the chimney, though I didn't hear any sound of activity. The area around it was uneven and littered with old fallen branches and pine needles. There was a small clearing, just enough to park my car, and beyond that, the forest rose up again, thick and dark. The cabin had a small porch, a door that creaked faintly as I pushed it open, and inside, it smelled faintly of old wood and something slightly musty, like it hadn't been used much in months. The interior was simple. A few beds, a small table, a wood stove, and some shelves with basic utensils and canned goods. It felt safe, practical, lived in without being cluttered. I unpacked my things and started a fire in the stove, appreciating the immediate warmth it provided. The sun disappeared completely soon after, leaving only the fading glow of twilight through the windows. I ate a quick dinner, then sat back, feeling the weight of silence pressing in. It was peaceful but also a little oppressive. The kind of silence that makes you hyper-aware of the small sounds you normally ignore. The scuttle of some animal outside, the groan of the cabin settling, the whisper of the wind through the trees. That night, I slept poorly. I woke several times to the sound of branches scraping against the cabin or the soft padding of something moving outside. I told myself it was just deer, or raccoons, or maybe the wind, but my heart would still race every time I heard it. By morning, I was tired but felt a strange kind of exhilaration from being completely alone. I spent the day exploring the immediate area, making notes on trails, a nearby stream, and the condition of the trees around the clearing. I even found a small, overgrown path that looked like it hadn't been used in years. Part of me wanted to follow it, to see where it led, but another part, the cautious part, warned me not to go too far from the cabin without letting anyone know. I photographed the surroundings, collected some dry firewood, and made mental notes about where I could take supplies in case I stayed longer than planned. The second night was when the real unease began. I had heard stories before about people thinking they were safe in the wilderness and then being caught off guard, and I started thinking about how thin that line actually was. The wind picked up after dark, rattling the cabin walls and whistling through the cracks between logs. The fire in the stove had burned low, casting dancing shadows across the walls. I had gone to bed earlier this time, trying to sleep off the lingering tension from the first night. Around midnight, I woke to a sound that made my stomach tighten. A deliberate, slow knocking at the side of the cabin. Not random branches, not the scuttle of an animal, but a knock that had intent behind it. I froze, listening. Then there it was again, softer but insistent, coming from the side window. My mind raced, and I remembered that I had left the cabin doors locked and latched. I hadn't seen anyone when I drove in. Who could possibly be here? The thought that someone had followed me or found their way in from the road, miles away, was terrifying. I moved quietly toward the window, trying not to make a sound, and peered outside. There was nothing. The moon was partially covered by clouds, and I could barely see beyond the clearing. No figure, no shadow, nothing. But I could feel it, the sense that someone or something was out there, watching. I sat back down, trying to convince myself it was imagination, stress, the sound of the wind on broken branches. But I didn't sleep again that night. I spent hours sitting in the dark, listening, gripping a kitchen knife I had kept near the bed, waiting for some movement that never came. By morning, I had resolved to be more vigilant. I reinforced the cabin door, checked all the windows, and made sure my phone and satellite device were fully charged. I started to feel like the forest wasn't just quiet, it was aware. Every sound was amplified. A branch snapping in the distance, the drip of condensation off leaves, the distant cry of a bird. I started noticing details I hadn't before. The way the trees leaned in certain directions, the patterns of animal tracks, the subtle changes in light and shadow on the forest floor. The fear I felt was no longer random anxiety. It was focused, sharp, and persistent. I realized that being alone in the wilderness wasn't just about survival in a physical sense. It was about being alert in every sense, questioning every sound, every movement, every shadow. I made a plan to explore only during daylight, marking the trails carefully so I could find my way back and staying close to the cabin's immediate perimeter. Over the next 2 days, I noticed other signs. At first subtle, almost ignorable. Footprints near the edge of the clearing that didn't match my own. A snapped branch leading into the woods, an area of disturbed soil. Then more overt. Someone had moved my woodpile slightly. I knew it because I had meticulously stacked it. My stomach sank. This wasn't just the forest being alive. Someone was here, and they had been inside my clearing. My thoughts spiraled. Who? How long had they been watching? Why hadn't I noticed before? I spent the day cleaning, stacking, and making noise to establish my presence, hoping to deter any potential intruder. At night, I didn't sleep at all. I sat in the corner with the knife, listening to every creak, every rustle, every distant snap. The mind does strange things when pushed to such tension, and I could feel it twisting, imagining sounds and movements that might not exist, but my instincts screamed that they did. On the 4th night, I made a critical decision. I couldn't stay here without being proactive, without confronting the reality that I was not alone. I decided I would leave at first light, no matter what. That night, I barely ate, barely touched my things. I sat, listening, eyes wide open, heart hammering. Around 2 in the morning, I heard it again, a crunch on the gravel outside. Slow, deliberate. I gripped the knife tighter, every muscle tense. It moved along the perimeter of the cabin, circling. I didn't dare move. I didn't dare make a sound. I kept waiting, praying the intruder would leave, or that they weren't armed, or that I could at least survive until dawn. Hours passed. The sounds eventually faded, replaced by the distant calls of nocturnal animals, but the fear didn't leave me. It was rooted deep now, a knowledge that my sanctuary could be breached at any time. When dawn finally broke, I moved quickly but quietly. I had made a plan the previous night. I would leave on foot first, staying on the path I had mapped, making my way to the nearest road where I could get a signal and call for help. I left the cabin door slightly ajar as a precaution in case someone was hiding inside. An instinctive decision to avoid confrontation. I packed only the essentials, moving with care, scanning the forest constantly. I noticed footprints in the soft dirt. Human. They were fresh. Whoever had been there last night had followed me in, tracking me through the clearing. My stomach churned, adrenaline pumping. I kept moving, not looking back, heading for the trail I had discovered earlier. Every sound became amplified, every shadow a potential threat. My mind played over every possible scenario, every escape route, every risk. But I stayed calm, controlled, because I had to. Panic here would mean death, or worse, being caught before reaching help. After nearly 3 hours of careful walking, keeping to shadows, moving slowly and silently, I emerged onto a wider path that led to the main dirt road. Relief washed over me in waves, but I remained cautious. I checked my phone, and for the first time in days, I got a weak signal. I never expected that a weekend away in a small, isolated cabin would turn into something that would change the way I think about being alone in the wilderness. I had been planning the trip for weeks. The idea was simple: escape the noise and stress of the city, leave my phone mostly off, and spend a couple of days in complete silence, just me and the forest. The cabin was supposed to be perfect for that. I had found it through a rental website, a small wooden structure tucked away at the edge of a forest, a few miles from the nearest road. Pictures showed a cozy living space, A small kitchen, a bedroom with a loft, and a front porch overlooking a clearing with tall trees around it. The listing said it was quiet, remote, and surrounded by hiking trails, the kind of place that promised peace. I arrived late in the afternoon. The drive from the city had taken longer than I thought because of construction and narrow forest roads that twisted and turned through the hills. By the time I reached the cabin, the sun was low in the sky, the light stretching long shadows across the dirt road that led up to it. The forest around me was thick, the trees tall and densely packed, and the only sound was the occasional rustle of wind through the leaves and the faint cry of a bird somewhere far away. Pulling up to the small clearing in front of the cabin, I noticed the quiet was different from what I was used to. It wasn't just the absence of people. It felt alive in a way that made me tense, as if the forest itself was watching. The cabin was exactly like the pictures. Old but well-kept, dark wood on the exterior, a stone chimney, windows with thin curtains. The door creaked when I opened it, and inside, there was a faint smell of wood smoke and damp earth, which didn't bother me but reminded me that this place had been empty for a while. I set my bags down, did a quick walk through the cabin, checking the small kitchen, the bathroom, and the loft bedroom. Everything seemed in place, neat and functional. The floorboards creaked when I stepped on them, the kind of noise that makes you aware of every little sound you make. I liked that. I liked knowing that there was nothing hiding in the walls, no hum of electricity or constant background noise. I decided to unpack slowly, leaving some items in the bedroom and placing my bag near the couch in the living area. I stacked some firewood next to the fireplace, figuring I would need it later that evening. The sun was fading, and I wanted to have light if I planned to stay in the cabin after dark. I turned on a small battery-powered lantern and set it on the kitchen counter. The soft yellow light illuminated the cabin in a warm glow, making it feel homely despite the remote location. I made myself a quick meal, just some canned soup and bread. While eating, I looked out the window into the forest. Shadows were growing long, stretching across the clearing, and I realized how small the cabin was compared to the vastness of the trees around it. I felt a strange mix of calm and unease. The calm came from being disconnected, away from everything. The unease came from realizing how utterly alone I was, with no neighbors for miles and no signal for my phone. I reminded myself that I had told a friend where I was going, that I had a small emergency kit in the car, and that I had my keys and flashlight. Rationally, I was safe. Emotionally, the forest pressed in around me. After eating, I stepped outside to check the area around the cabin. The air was cool, carrying the smell of damp soil and pine. I walked along the clearing, hearing my boots crunch on the dry leaves, noticing the way the trees blocked the light. The sky was turning to twilight, the last colors of sunset fading into a deep blue. I realized how dark it would get soon. I stood still for a moment, listening. The wind whispered through the branches, the leaves rattled gently, and somewhere in the distance, I heard the call of a coyote. I thought about the trails I had seen leading away from the cabin, winding into the deeper forest. For a brief moment, I considered taking a short walk, but then I remembered how isolated I was. I decided to wait until morning, to start fresh with daylight. Night came fast. I lit a fire in the fireplace, the kind that crackled and popped, sending small sparks into the air. I sat on the couch wrapped in a blanket, listening to the fire and the forest outside. I could hear small noises, twigs snapping under the weight of unseen animals, the occasional gust of wind moving branches, the distant howls of coyotes or foxes. Every noise made me tense, my heart picking up its pace for a few seconds before I reminded myself I was alone and that nothing could reach me immediately. Still, the tension never fully left. The forest had its own rhythm, and I was a visitor in its world. Around midnight, I heard something that made my blood run cold. At first, I wasn't sure what it was. A faint sound, like the scraping of metal against wood, coming from the direction of the cabin's backside. I froze, trying to listen carefully. The sound repeated, irregular, soft but deliberate. My heart was racing, and my first instinct was to dismiss it as a branch falling or an animal moving through the undergrowth. But then I realized the sound didn't match the randomness of nature. It was deliberate, slow, and careful. Someone or something was outside, moving around the cabin. I grabbed my flashlight and carefully moved to the nearest window. Peering out into the darkness, I could barely see through the thick trees and shadows. My eyes adjusted, and I caught a glimpse of movement at the edge of the clearing. A figure, hunched slightly, moving in a careful, measured way. My mind screamed for logic. How could someone have gotten here undetected? The road to the cabin was miles away, the nearest neighbor further. Yet there it was, someone or something standing among the trees. I didn't have a weapon. I had a flashlight, a fire poker, and my wits. I remembered the emergency kit in my car, but getting to it meant leaving the cabin. I didn't want to risk it. I crouched low, trying not to make any sound. My flashlight held ready. The figure didn't move closer, didn't run, didn't make any noise. It just stayed there, in the shadows, watching. Minutes passed, though it felt like hours. My mind raced. I thought of locking myself in the loft bedroom, of calling the police, but the phone had no signal. I tried to stay calm, focusing on my breathing, telling myself that if it had wanted to attack, it would have already done so. Eventually, the figure moved away. Slowly, it retreated into the shadows of the forest. I didn't see it leave the clearing entirely, but the scraping noise had stopped. I waited a long time, listening. The forest slowly returned to its normal rhythm. My body was shaking, my hands trembling from adrenaline. I knew I couldn't stay awake all night, but I also knew sleep would make me vulnerable. I stayed by the fireplace, leaning against the wall, with the fire between me and the darkness outside, until the first light of dawn. Morning came, and I stepped outside carefully, surveying the clearing. There was a mark on the ground, like a footprint pressed into the soil, too large to be mine and too precise to be a deer or a bear. The imprint showed the outline of a boot, the kind that hikers or hunters might wear. My stomach sank. Someone had been there in the night, close enough to watch me, close enough to know I was alone. I felt violated in a way I hadn't expected. I decided to stay alert but continued with my planned activities. I checked the surrounding area, inspected the perimeter, and made sure all windows and doors were secured. I took photographs of the footprint, just in case. I had decided that leaving immediately was an option, but I also realized I needed to understand what had happened before panicking. The day passed slowly. I stayed inside mostly, moving cautiously, checking windows frequently. I heard other noises during the day, branches snapping far away, the rustle of animals, but nothing that suggested a person. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every shadow seemed deeper, every movement among the trees more purposeful. I tried to distract myself, reading a book, cleaning the cabin, chopping more firewood, making a plan for a safe exit. By late afternoon, I realized I needed to act. I couldn't stay another night, not knowing if someone was lingering in the forest. I packed my things, gathering food, clothes, and valuables, and left the cabin ready to return to my car. I walked carefully to the road, constantly scanning the tree line for movement. The walk was tense, every sound exaggerated in my mind, every shadow suspicious. But I made it to my car without incident. As I drove away, I looked back at the cabin, at the small clearing surrounded by forest. The thought that someone could have been watching me, hiding, waiting, made my skin crawl. I realized how vulnerable I had been, how easy it would be for someone to take advantage of isolation. The drive back to the city was long, but I stayed alert the entire time, checking mirrors, listening for any sound behind me. When I finally reached my apartment, the sense of safety returned slowly. I called the local authorities, reported the incident, gave them the description of the footprint, the time, the location, everything I could remember. They said they would patrol the area and investigate. I never returned to the cabin, and I never rented an isolated place without thorough security. I had been looking forward to the cabin trip for months. I needed isolation, a place to think, a place where the weight of my life could not reach me. The cabin itself was remote, tucked deep into the mountains, accessible only by a winding dirt road that twisted through dense pine and spruce forests. My map said it was about 12 miles from the nearest town, and I figured it would take at least an hour to get there, even in a four-wheel drive truck. The GPS was unreliable, and the area had little cell reception. That was exactly what I wanted. No messages, no calls, nothing but the wind through the trees and the occasional call of a distant bird. The drive was longer than I expected. The last 5 miles had been almost impassable. Loose gravel shifted under the tires, and the incline was steep enough that I had to switch to 4-wheel drive. On either side, the forest pressed close, so close that I felt as if the trees themselves were watching, waiting for me to slip off the path. I kept thinking about turning back, about how foolish it might be to travel alone into such isolation, but I pressed on. The thought of solitude and being away from the city's constant noise pulled me forward with an irresistible force. When I finally crested a small rise, the cabin came into view. It was older than I expected, built from thick, dark logs that had weathered to a deep brown, almost black in places. The roof sagged slightly in the middle, and the windows were small, dusty, and opaque. A thin plume of smoke rose from the chimney, indicating that someone had been there recently, though the driveway and surrounding area were otherwise empty. The sight of the smoke made me pause, a small knot of unease forming in my stomach. But there was no one around, no car parked nearby, no sound of life. I shrugged it off. Maybe the previous visitors had left just hours ago. Maybe they lived somewhere out of sight in the forest. It didn't matter. I needed this. I parked the truck and stepped out. The air was sharp, smelling of pine and damp earth. The sun was low, casting long shadows that stretched across the uneven ground around the cabin. The quiet was absolute, not the quiet of a city night, where distant sounds hint at life, but the kind of quiet that pressed in from all directions, filling your ears and your chest until you could almost hear your own heartbeat echoing in your skull. The cabin door was old and heavy, but it opened without much resistance. Inside, the air smelled of wood smoke and something else, a faint mustiness that spoke of neglect and disuse. Dust coated every surface, and cobwebs draped the corners like old lace. The floorboards creaked under my weight, and the walls seemed to absorb sound, making each step feel louder than it should have. I dropped my bag near the fireplace and walked around, inspecting the cabin. The living space was small but functional, with a wood stove, a small table, a couple of chairs, and a narrow bed pushed into the corner. There was a small kitchen area with a sink, a few shelves, and a cold, dark refrigerator that hummed faintly. Nothing here had been touched in a while, but it was still intact and usable. I spent the next hour getting settled. I swept the dust off the table, stacked firewood near the stove, and unpacked the few supplies I had brought. I wanted to make the cabin feel like mine, even if only for a few days. As the light faded outside, I built a small fire, the dry wood crackling and popping as it caught flame. The warmth was immediate and comforting, a thin barrier against the chill of the mountain evening. I ate a simple meal I had brought with me, sitting in the glow of the fire and listening to the forest beyond. At first, the sounds were distant, a branch snapping under some unseen weight, the rustle of leaves as a small animal scurried through the undergrowth. It was normal, natural, but as the night deepened, the sounds became sharper, more insistent. I could hear twigs breaking in ways that suggested something larger than a rabbit or a deer. I tried to tell myself it was just the wind, but deep down I knew the forest was full of things that moved silently until they didn't. Sleep came fitfully. I lay on the narrow bed and stared at the ceiling, listening. Every noise startled me. The wind through the broken shingles rattled the roof, making me jump. My imagination, fueled by isolation, began to fill in the blanks. What if someone had come here while I was driving? What if the previous visitors hadn't left at all? I tried to reason with myself. The cabin was far from the road. No one would have seen me arrive. There was no one to see them, either. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was not entirely alone. The next morning, I woke to an eerie silence. The usual forest sounds were gone. No birds, no rustling leaves, no distant calls. Just the cabin, the trees, and the wind moving in subtle gusts. I checked the perimeter of the cabin, walking slowly, scanning the shadows between trees. Nothing, no footprints, no signs of recent visitors. But I felt it, an instinctive sense that someone or something had been watching the cabin. My pulse quickened, but I forced myself to breathe and consider. Isolation was a strange thing. It could make your mind play tricks on you. Maybe that's all it was. I spent the day hiking a nearby trail I had seen on the map. The trail was overgrown, but manageable, leading up to a ridge that offered a sweeping view of the valley below. The climb was exhausting, my legs burning with every step, but the view made it worth it. The mountains stretched endlessly, rolling hills dotted with forests and streams. I could see the small ribbon of the dirt road I had driven in on, far below, winding through the trees. The thought that I was completely alone hit me again. I felt a strange mixture of freedom and fear, both exhilarating and paralyzing. By the time I returned to the cabin, the sun was low, and shadows had returned to press against the cabin's walls like dark, shifting shapes. That night, the noises came again, louder, closer. Something was moving near the cabin. Not an animal, not exactly. Too deliberate, too careful. My imagination ran wild, trying to fill in the details. The shadows beyond the windows moved in patterns that didn't make sense. Branches broke at regular intervals, almost like deliberate footsteps. I stayed awake for hours, listening, my body tense, my eyes darting to every corner of the room. The windows, the fireplace. I didn't sleep at all, instead sitting by the fire until it burned down to embers, my mind racing. The following day, I decided to explore the area more thoroughly. I kept my distance from the cabin, walking into the forest with only a small backpack of water and snacks. The terrain was uneven, filled with hidden roots and fallen logs that could easily twist an ankle. As I moved deeper, I realized how truly remote I was. No sounds of civilization reached here. The forest was dense, and the further I walked, the harder it became to navigate. I marked my path carefully, tying small pieces of ribbon to branches so I could find my way back. After a few hours, I came across a small creek. The water was clear and cold. I knelt to drink, the sound of the flowing water strangely comforting. But even here, I felt eyes on me. The hairs on the back of my neck prickled. I glanced around. No one, nothing, just the trees and the endless shadows they cast. Returning to the cabin, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. Near the truck, in the soft dirt, were footprints, larger than mine, heavier. Someone had been here while I was hiking. My first instinct was panic. I scanned the forest edge, trying to see if anyone was still there. Nothing. I debated leaving immediately, driving down the dirt road and heading back to town. But part of me froze, unable to act. I had no way of knowing if whoever had been here was still around. If they were watching, moving, hiding. The thought of confrontation, of trying to escape unseen, made my blood run cold. That night, I barricaded the doors and windows as best I could. I stacked chairs against the door, shoved firewood against the frame. The forest outside was alive with sound now, every noise amplified in my mind. Branches snapping, leaves rustling, a faint thump as if something heavy had landed. I stayed awake, clutching a flashlight, my ears straining. Hours passed. I didn't sleep. I couldn't. I could hear nothing and everything at once. The forest felt alive, hostile. I imagined eyes peering at me from behind every tree, every shadow. The following morning, I ventured cautiously outside. The footprints were gone. No trace of anyone, nothing disturbed except for my own tracks and the truck. Relief mixed with unease. Maybe it had all been imagined, or maybe the person had left quietly in the night. I cleaned up the barricades, trying to restore a sense of normalcy, but I remained hyper-aware, scanning the forest, listening for sounds, examining the light for movement. My solitude had become dangerous, the line between real and imagined blurred. I spent the next 2 days preparing an escape plan. I mapped routes back to the main road, found alternative paths in case the truck failed, and stockpiled food and water in case I had to wait for help. Every time I stepped outside the cabin, I felt exposed, vulnerable, a target. I couldn't shake the feeling that I had always liked the idea of being completely alone in the woods, not in a romantic or picturesque sense, but in a practical, almost experimental way. I wanted to see if I could manage everything myself for a week. No distractions, no responsibilities, no constant noise, just silence and my own thoughts. I found a small, isolated cabin online, hidden deep in a forested area about 6 hours from the nearest town. It was described as off-grid, with no electricity or running water, but with a wood stove, a small solar panel for minimal charging, and a basic outhouse. For me, it sounded perfect. I arrived in the early afternoon, driving down a narrow dirt road that turned into a rutted trail, bouncing the rental SUV over rocks and tree roots. The forest around me was thick and dense, the kind where sunlight barely reached the forest floor. Every bend in the trail seemed to conceal shadows that shifted as I passed. When I finally saw the cabin, it looked even smaller than I imagined, just a single-story structure with a steep, moss-covered roof, dark wood siding, and a thin plume of smoke curling from the chimney. It wasn't fancy, but it had a sense of permanence, as if it had been here for decades, quietly enduring the elements. I parked and stepped out, inhaling the crisp air, heavy with the smell of pine and damp earth. The cabin was surrounded by a clearing about the size of a small yard. Beyond that, the trees stretched endlessly in every direction, tall, close together, and silent. The forest was still, except for the occasional creak of branches and the distant rustle of leaves. I noticed the sun was already beginning to sink behind the trees, and the shadows it cast were long and sharp. There was no road nearby, no other structures, nothing that suggested anyone else might be here. It was utterly isolated. The cabin was small but functional. Inside, there was a single room with a wood stove, a table, a few chairs, and a small bed in the corner. Shelves lined one wall, stocked with canned food, jars of dried beans, rice, a few cooking utensils, and basic supplies. A small solar panel was mounted outside the window, angled toward the late afternoon sun. The floor creaked under my boots, and the air inside smelled faintly of wood smoke and damp pine. There was a small pile of firewood stacked neatly beside the stove, enough for a week if I rationed it carefully. I unpacked my bag slowly, laying out my clothes, food, and tools. I had brought extra batteries, a flashlight, matches, a pocket knife, and a first aid kit. I lit a small fire in the stove to warm the cabin before nightfall. As the fire crackled and the room warmed, I sat on the edge of the bed and looked around. The walls were bare, the windows dirty, but the view outside was extraordinary. A forest so dense it seemed endless, and a small creek visible through the trees, its water glinting in the fading light. I spent the next hour exploring the surrounding area, staying within a few hundred feet of the cabin. The forest was thick, and the undergrowth tangled around my legs as I walked. I marked a few trees near the edge of the clearing so I wouldn't get lost, though I wasn't planning to venture far. Birds flew overhead, crows mostly, their calls sharp and distant. I noticed footprints in the mud, small and medium-sized, probably deer, maybe a fox or raccoon. Nothing alarming, though I felt a faint twinge of unease, the kind that comes from knowing you are entirely alone in a vast, wild place. That first night was quiet, almost painfully so. The wind rustled through the treetops, sending occasional claps of sound echoing through the forest. I fed the fire, checked the lock on the cabin door, and tried to relax. I lay on the bed, listening to the forest around me, noting how completely sound travels when there's nothing else. Every crack of a branch, every rustle of leaves, seemed amplified. Around midnight, I heard a low, sustained snapping sound, like a branch breaking under weight. It was far enough away that I couldn't see it, but close enough to make my heart beat faster. I sat up slowly, scanning the darkened windows. Nothing moved. I told myself it was probably a deer or a raccoon, maybe a falling branch. But even as I tried to reason, the sound repeated, quieter this time, and my sense of being alone shifted slightly, becoming more tense, more alert. The next day, I spent time exploring further. I found the creek, a small, shallow stream with clear water. The sunlight filtered through the canopy above, creating patches of light on the moss-covered rocks. I collected some water in a bottle, planning to boil it later. As I walked, I noticed signs that someone or something else had been here. Broken branches along a trail, footprints in the mud that weren't mine. They were faint and hard to trace, but definitely not deer. I tried to convince myself it was my imagination, that I was too attuned to the forest sounds now. But the thought lingered, a faint sense of being observed. By the third day, I had settled into a routine. I collected water, chopped firewood, prepared simple meals, and walked the forest trails. I kept my knife on my belt at all times, not because I expected danger, but because it felt prudent. That evening, as I sat by the fire, I noticed something unusual. The shadows outside were darker, moving differently. The wind had died down, and the forest seemed quieter than usual. And then I heard it, a sound at the edge of the clearing, soft but deliberate, like footsteps crunching through dead leaves. I froze. The sound stopped as suddenly as it had started. I waited, breath shallow, straining to hear anything. Nothing. The fire popped, and I told myself again it was probably nothing, that I was being paranoid. The following days, the feeling of being watched grew stronger. I began noticing more signs, footprints near the cabin door, bent branches in the underbrush, subtle disturbances in the forest floor. Every time I went outside, I scanned the trees carefully, listening. Sometimes I thought I saw movement, a shadow that disappeared when I blinked. I didn't want to leave, not yet. I had come here to test my own limits, to prove I could manage alone. But each evening, the tension coiled tighter around my chest, the quiet becoming oppressive. On the fifth night, the weather changed. Heavy clouds moved in, and the wind picked up, rattling the roof and shaking the walls of the cabin. I fed the fire constantly, worried it might go out, leaving me cold in the damp air. Around midnight, I heard the footsteps again, closer this time, circling the cabin. I couldn't see anything through the darkness, but the sound was unmistakable. My first instinct was to hide, but there was nowhere to hide in the tiny cabin. I gripped my knife, every muscle tensed. The footsteps stopped abruptly, and then silence. My mind raced. Whoever or whatever was out there knew I was aware. They were deliberate. They were testing me. The next day, I resolved to investigate. I packed a small bag with essentials: water, flashlight, knife, first aid kit, and decided to follow the tracks. They led me into the forest, winding between trees and over rocks, deeper than I had ventured before. The footprints were human-sized, not mine, and fresh. I followed cautiously, trying to remain as quiet as possible. After an hour, I stumbled onto something unexpected. A small campsite, crudely made, hidden in a thicket. There was a fire pit, now cold, a torn tarp, and remnants of a sleeping bag. Someone had been here, recently, and had probably been watching me. Panic set in. I knew I had to leave, but the forest was vast, and my cabin was my only immediate refuge. I retraced my steps, trying to stay calm, returning to the cabin as fast as I could without making noise. Once inside, I locked the door, stacked firewood against it, and sat down, trying to plan. I had food, water, and the tools I needed. I realized that panic would only make things worse. I had to stay rational. That night, I barely slept. Every sound was magnified. Branches cracking, leaves rustling. Even my own movements seemed deafening. The footsteps came again, circling the cabin, deliberate, slow. I gripped my knife, pressed against the wall, and waited. Hours passed. The sounds faded with the pre-dawn light. I was exhausted, terrified, but alive. I spent the next day preparing. I reinforced the cabin door with planks and rocks, made a small weapon from a broken chair leg, and organized supplies near the bed for easy access. I also created a mental map of escape routes through the forest in case I had to leave suddenly. I realized that being proactive was the only way to survive. On the seventh day, I decided it was time to leave. I had learned what I had come to learn. I could survive alone, and I could face fear. But staying another day, with the evidence that someone had been watching me, was reckless. I packed my bag, extinguished the fire carefully, and stepped outside at dawn. The forest was quiet, almost eerily so. I followed the path I had driven in on, moving cautiously but steadily. I had been planning this trip for months. The cabin was tucked away deep in the northern woods, a place far from roads, far from people, far from cell service. The isolation had been exactly what I wanted. The idea of waking up to the sound of wind through the trees, the distant calls of birds, the crunch of snow under my boots, it all seemed like a perfect escape. I had imagined it over and over in my mind, picturing quiet mornings, slow walks through the forest, nights reading by the fireplace with the soft smell of wood smoke in the air. I never imagined how quickly that idea of peace could turn into something else entirely. The drive itself had been long and narrow. The roads became increasingly rough as I drove further into the woods, the asphalt breaking into gravel, the gravel turning into dirt, and finally, a barely noticeable track that disappeared under fallen leaves and mud. My old car struggled over the ruts, the suspension rattling so hard I was sure something would break. The GPS had stopped working miles ago. I knew the directions to the cabin were written down somewhere, but I had relied too much on the GPS, and now I was driving by memory, trying to follow the vague landmarks I thought I remembered. Large boulders, a stream that crossed the path, a fallen pine blocking part of the track. Each one felt like a warning I didn't quite understand yet. I reached the clearing eventually. The cabin was smaller than I expected. A one-story structure with a stone chimney, weathered wood walls, and a roof that sagged slightly under years of snow. Around it, the forest seemed to press close, as if it were watching. There were no other buildings, no cars, nothing but trees and the rough dirt road that led back towards civilization. I parked and got out. The air was crisp, cold enough that it burned my lungs when I inhaled too sharply, and I could smell the dampness of wet leaves and earth. I carried my bags to the porch, noting the loose boards underfoot. The cabin door creaked loudly as I pushed it open, the sound echoing oddly in the empty space inside. The air smelled musty, a mixture of old wood, dust, and the faint lingering scent of whatever previous occupants had left behind. I set my bags down and began to explore. The interior was small, just a main room with a stone fireplace, a kitchenette along one wall, and a narrow hallway leading to a bedroom and bathroom. The furniture was sparse and simple. A small table and 2 chairs, a couch, a few shelves with old books, and a bed with a thin mattress and faded sheets. Everything looked like it had been used heavily in the past, then abandoned. The cabin had electricity, but the wiring seemed old, and the lights flickered slightly when I turned them on. I shrugged. It was enough. I unpacked, stacked my supplies neatly in corners, and checked the firewood pile outside. The wood was damp, but usable, and I started a small fire in the fireplace, enjoying the sudden warmth and the soft crackle of the flames. Night fell faster than I expected. The forest became dark and thick, the sky disappearing behind the black silhouettes of trees. Inside the cabin, I could hear the wind whistle through gaps in the walls and roof. Every little sound felt magnified. A branch scraping against the cabin felt like someone dragging a foot across the floor. A distant thump of something falling in the woods made my stomach tighten. I told myself it was normal, the wind, the animals, but the tension in my chest didn't ease. I realized that while I had thought I wanted complete isolation, the reality of being completely alone in such a vast, dark forest was different. It wasn't quiet or peaceful. It was alive in a way that I hadn't expected. I tried to sleep, but it was nearly impossible. Every noise startled me. Every shadow seemed to shift. At some point, I heard a faint scraping sound outside the cabin, like nails dragging across wood. My heart leapt into my throat, and I froze, listening. The sound stopped, then started again a few minutes later, closer this time. I crept toward the window, careful not to make noise, and peered out. Darkness. Nothing but the outlines of trees and the faint flicker of the firelight on the cabin walls. I told myself it was probably an animal, maybe a raccoon, maybe a deer. But even as I said it, I knew it didn't sound like an animal I had ever heard before. It was deliberate, slow, careful. Sleep finally came in short bursts, filled with dreams of being trapped, of someone or something moving just out of sight. When I woke, it was still dark, the fire having burned low. I fumbled to build it back up, my hands shaking slightly. I checked the locks on the doors. Everything seemed secure, though the old wood groaned under the wind. I kept thinking about going outside to look for whatever had been making the sound, but a part of me was terrified that I might actually see something. The morning brought a false sense of calm. The sun barely reached the cabin, filtered through the dense canopy. I made breakfast, boiled water, and tried to organize my day as I had planned. A long hike, exploration of the surrounding area. But the memory of the night's sounds lingered. I packed a small bag with water, a map, and my compass. I tried to keep track of landmarks carefully, aware now that the forest was much denser than I had expected. The paths unclear and sometimes disappearing into overgrown brush. Hours passed. I found no animals, no signs of people, just trees, mud, and silence. The silence pressed down on me, heavy, making each small sound. The crack of a branch under my foot, the distant rush of water, a jolt of tension. By late afternoon, I realized I had lost my sense of direction. The landmarks I had noted were gone, replaced by unfamiliar trees, fallen logs, and twisted undergrowth. I tried to backtrack, but the forest seemed to shift, paths splitting and converging in ways that made no sense. Anxiety built in my chest, slow and steady, as I realized that I had underestimated how isolated I really was. I began to move faster, my breaths coming in short gasps, trying to remember which way led back to the cabin. The sun was sinking now, the forest shadows growing long and dark. Panic crept in. I tried to calm myself, telling myself I had a compass, that I could find my way, but every step felt heavier. Every rustle in the bushes made me freeze, imagining that whatever had been around the cabin at night had followed me. As darkness fell, I stumbled over a root and scraped my arm badly, the blood dripping down and mixing with the dirt. Pain and exhaustion clouded my thoughts. I considered staying put, but the cabin felt miles away. I needed shelter, and the night would be merciless if I remained in the open. I remembered a small clearing I had passed earlier and decided to head for it, hoping to find some flat ground to rest until morning. Each step felt heavier, my body growing weaker from fatigue, fear, and cold. Finally, I stumbled into the clearing. It was small but flat, with no immediate trees overhead. I sank to the ground, trying to rest, wrapping my jacket tightly around me. I listened to the forest, straining for sound, heart pounding. Hours passed, or it felt like hours. Somewhere nearby, I heard movement, but it was distant, careful, deliberate. I tried to focus on breathing, on keeping warm. I realized the next day would require careful planning just to get back to the cabin alive. I couldn't rely on memory alone anymore. I would need landmarks, cautious movement, and patience. Panic had to be set aside if I wanted to survive this isolation. By the first light of morning, I began to move again. Using the compass, careful observation of the sun, and markings I made along the way, I slowly navigated the forest. Each step was calculated, careful. Each rustle of leaves or snapping branch caused a jolt of fear, but I forced myself to keep moving. Eventually, hours later, I spotted the cabin in the distance, faint but unmistakable. Relief washed over me, stronger than anything I had ever felt. I limped to the door, grateful for the small fire that still burned weakly inside, grateful for walls that provided shelter, and grateful that I had made it back without encountering whatever might have been out there. I spent the rest of the day fortifying the cabin, boarding loose planks, clearing brush, and preparing firewood. I made myself a small plan. I would not wander again without leaving clear markers and would never underestimate how dangerous isolation could be. The forest was alive, unpredictable, and indifferent. It did not need to be supernatural to be terrifying. In that moment, I understood that survival required respect for the wilderness, caution, and humility. I felt exhausted, battered, and tense, but alive. And for the first time in days, I slept through the night without fear, the fire warm, the cabin strong, the woods outside quiet but no longer threatening. I never imagined that the cabin I rented for the weekend would turn into one of the most terrifying experiences of my life. It was a small wooden structure tucked away at the edge of a forest, far from the nearest town. I had found it online, advertised as secluded, peaceful, and surrounded by nature. And at the time, the idea of being alone in the quiet woods seemed like exactly what I needed. I had been stressed from work for months, and the thought of leaving behind emails, phone calls, and traffic for a few days of isolation felt like a dream. I packed my bag with a few clothes, food, water, and some basic tools, imagining myself sitting by the fireplace, reading books, and enjoying the calm. The drive to the cabin was long and winding, taking me through narrow dirt roads that twisted and turned in ways that made me wonder if my GPS even knew where I was going. Trees lined both sides, so tall and close together that sunlight barely touched the road. There was something almost claustrophobic about it, but at the same time, I felt a strange sense of calm. I told myself that this was what I needed, a place away from the noise, away from people. I noticed very few cars, and those I did pass seemed to appear and vanish like shadows, leaving me alone on the road again. When I finally reached the cabin, it looked exactly like it had in the pictures. Small, rustic, with weathered wooden walls and a pitched roof. A thin trail led up to the door, and the surrounding forest seemed dense and untouched. I parked my car next to the cabin, opened the trunk, and carried in my bag. The air was cool and smelled like wet soil and pine needles. I noticed the forest around me was almost unnervingly quiet. No birds were chirping, no insects buzzing, just a thick silence that seemed to press in on me. I dismissed it at first, telling myself the stillness was just part of being out in the wilderness. I placed my bag on the floor and took a moment to look around. The interior was small but cozy. There was a small kitchen area, a fireplace with a stack of wood beside it, and a narrow staircase leading to a loft that served as the bedroom. The first evening passed without incident. I started a fire in the fireplace, cooked a simple meal, and sat on the wooden chair by the window, watching the sun disappear behind the trees. The forest turned dark quickly, and shadows stretched across the cabin walls as the light faded. I remember feeling an odd sensation, a creeping awareness that I was completely alone. It wasn't fear yet, more like the realization of total isolation. Still, I told myself it was exactly what I wanted: solitude, nothing more. The first night was the beginning of the unsettling feeling. I had left the fire burning low, and as I lay in the loft bed, the sounds of the forest outside began to grow louder in the darkness. At first, it was the expected noises. Branches creaking, leaves rustling, perhaps a small animal moving through the underbrush. But then, I began hearing sounds that didn't match any normal animal activity. Soft, slow footsteps, almost like someone was walking in the forest, circling the cabin. I told myself it was impossible. There was no one else around. My car was still parked outside. No one had passed by while I was inside. Yet the noise persisted, soft but distinct, a deliberate rhythm that didn't match the random chaos of nature. I stayed frozen in bed, staring at the dark ceiling, trying to convince myself it was my imagination. Eventually, the noise stopped, or I stopped noticing it as I drifted off to sleep. I woke up early the next morning with a stiff neck and a tight feeling in my chest. The cabin was cold, the fireplace had died, and the sunlight that had been creeping through the window was now bright enough to illuminate the small room. I got up and walked downstairs, checking the cabin. Everything seemed as I had left it, and I found nothing that could explain the sounds I had heard. I decided to take a walk outside to clear my head. As I moved into the forest, I noticed how dense the trees were and how quickly the path I had taken to the cabin disappeared behind me. I had no intention of venturing far, but even walking a few hundred feet into the forest made me realize just how isolated I truly was. I started to notice broken branches, flattened patches of grass, and scuff marks in the soil that suggested movement that didn't belong to me. I tried to rationalize it. Perhaps deer or other animals had passed through, but the marks seemed too deliberate, as if someone or something had walked slowly around the cabin, not in a straight line but circling, inspecting. The thought made my stomach tighten. Returning to the cabin, I felt a rising unease. I decided to double-check the locks on the doors and windows. Everything was secure, but the sense of being watched lingered. That night, the footsteps returned, louder and closer. This time, they weren't outside in the forest. They seemed to be just beyond the cabin walls, moving deliberately around the structure. I stayed in the loft, gripping a heavy kitchen knife I had taken for safety, listening. The steps paused occasionally, then continued. I couldn't see anyone, but the sound of boots or heavy shoes on dry leaves echoed through the night in a pattern that no animal could make. Sleep didn't come easily. Every small noise made me tense. At one point, I thought I heard the front door handle jiggling, but when I froze and listened, it stopped. I realized that even if the door were locked, the very sound of someone testing it could paralyze me with fear. Hours passed like this. I eventually fell into a shallow, restless sleep, only to be awakened before dawn by a loud crash outside. My heart raced as I got out of bed, knife in hand, and ran to the window. Nothing moved, but something heavy had fallen, perhaps a branch, or maybe something else. I had no way of knowing. The next day, I resolved to be more careful. I didn't go far from the cabin, keeping close to the structure. I improvised simple traps around the cabin perimeter with sticks and rocks, hoping that if someone tried to approach, I would be alerted. I also tried to call for help, but cell service was non-existent. My mind raced as I thought about every possibility. A criminal hiding in the forest, someone watching the cabin for weeks, maybe even an escaped convict. All of it seemed plausible. The realization that I was completely isolated, without immediate help, sank in fully. By the second night, my exhaustion made the fear feel almost unbearable. I slept fitfully, waking to every sound. The footsteps returned. This time, I heard them pacing near the back of the cabin. I went to the window to look but saw nothing. Then I noticed something that made my blood run cold. Footprints in the thin layer of frost that had formed overnight. They circled the cabin, large and deliberate, disappearing into the trees. The person, or people, had been there, walking around the cabin, testing it, watching me. I realized that I had to do something or wait for them to make a move. I spent the third day preparing. I gathered wood and sharpened stakes, reinforced doors and windows as best as I could. I made a simple alarm system by tying cans to strings around the perimeter. I tried to stay calm, reminding myself that I could survive this, that I just needed to remain aware and patient. By nightfall, I was ready. I stayed awake, sitting by the fireplace with my knife, listening. Hours passed. I was sure I could hear the footsteps again, but nothing came too close. I waited until early morning, just before the sun rose, when I felt I could risk looking outside. To my relief, I saw a car approaching from the distance on the dirt road. It wasn't someone coming to harm me. It was a ranger, a man checking the area. I ran out of the cabin, waving frantically. He stopped and listened as I explained my situation, how I had felt watched, how the footprints circled the cabin. He nodded, took notes, and drove around the area. Within an hour, the police arrived. They confirmed that the area had been used recently by a small group of burglars who had been hiding out in the forest, planning to rob cabins in the region. My traps, precautions, and constant vigilance had kept me safe. They searched the forest and found evidence of the group nearby, but by the time the authorities arrived, the criminals had abandoned the area, likely alerted by my makeshift alarms. By the end of the day, I felt an overwhelming sense of relief. I packed up my things and left the cabin, fully aware of how close I had come to being in serious danger. Driving away, I looked at the trees, the dark shadows, and the narrow roads, but instead of fear, I felt a sense of triumph. I had survived, relied on my own awareness and preparation, and made it through a situation that could have been disastrous. The cabin that had once seemed peaceful had become a place of tension and fear, but I left with a clear understanding of my own strength and caution. Even weeks later, I could still remember the sound of footsteps circling the cabin, the cold night air pressing against the windows, and the unsettling silence of the forest. But I also remembered the clarity, the focus, and the sense of preparedness that had saved me. I never returned to that cabin, but I learned something invaluable. Nature itself isn't dangerous. It's the people hiding in it that are. And when faced with real danger, staying calm, observant, and ready can make the difference between fear and survival. I never imagined that a weekend away in a remote cabin could turn into one of the most intense experiences of my life. I had always been someone who liked solitude, someone who preferred the quiet of forests and the sound of wind through trees to the constant hum of a city. I found cabins online, small, unassuming places deep in the wilderness, and I was drawn to one tucked away along a winding mountain road. The photos promised privacy, peace, and a kind of isolation I rarely experienced in my daily life. I had no idea how much that isolation could feel overwhelming when it became absolute. The journey there was long, mostly because the roads grew narrower and rougher as I climbed the mountain. My car was older, a reliable four-wheel drive, but the gravel and mud made progress slow. Branches scraped the sides, and in some places, the path was just wide enough for one vehicle, bordered by steep drop-offs and dense thickets of evergreens. The forest seemed alive in a way that was peaceful during daylight, but I noticed small warning signs, like fresh animal tracks crossing the path and the occasional snapping of a twig somewhere unseen. I didn't feel unsafe yet, but I made a mental note to drive slowly. By the time I reached the cabin, the sun was low in the sky, casting long shadows across the clearing. The cabin itself was modest, built from rough-hewn logs, with a metal roof and a small porch. A stack of firewood leaned against the side, and a dirt path led to a small stream that glimmered in the fading light. I parked the car and took a moment to just breathe in the air, sharp and cold but clean, scented with pine and wet earth. It felt good to be away from everything. I unloaded my things, carrying bags filled with clothes, food, and camping supplies inside. The interior was simple but functional. A small kitchen with a propane stove, a wooden table, and chairs. A single room with a bed, a small wood stove, and shelves for storage. The walls were bare, save for a few hooks for coats and hats. There was no internet, no phone signal strong enough to make calls, and only a small solar lantern for light at night. It was exactly what I wanted. Isolation. I unpacked carefully, placing my belongings neatly, organizing the kitchen supplies, and stacking wood near the stove. I made a mental note to check the firewood in the morning, knowing that nights would be cold. I decided to explore the area before darkness fell completely. The forest surrounding the cabin was dense, with a thick undergrowth that made moving through it slower than expected. I followed the stream for a short distance, careful not to slip on moss-covered rocks. I noticed deer tracks, probably fresh, and small footprints of raccoons or foxes. Birds flew overhead, their calls echoing through the trees. There was a stillness that felt profound, but also slightly intimidating. In the city, quiet was comforting. Here, it was something else entirely, a silence that made every small sound, my foot on a rock, the brush of leaves, feel exaggerated. As night began to fall, I returned to the cabin. I started a fire in the wood stove, feeling its warmth fill the room. The first night was peaceful. I prepared a simple meal, roasted over the stove, and ate while listening to the forest outside. Owls called somewhere in the distance, their cries long and mournful. I settled into the bed with a book, the cabin illuminated by the orange glow of the fire and the dim lantern. I felt content, disconnected from the world and yet alive in a way I rarely felt in everyday life. The second day began early. I woke to the sounds of birds and the faint rush of the stream outside. The sun had barely reached the clearing when I stepped outside, stretching and breathing in the morning air. I planned to hike further along the ridge behind the cabin, curious about the view. The trail was overgrown in places, and I had to push branches aside and step over fallen logs. The forest was thicker than I expected, and the path less distinct. I found a few small clearings, each with its own character, one with a patch of wildflowers, another with moss-covered stones and the remnants of what looked like an old campsite. By midday, I had walked several miles, my legs tired but satisfied. I stopped by a small pond I hadn't noticed on the map, its surface smooth and reflective. The air smelled damp and earthy, and I watched as small fish stirred beneath the water. I took off my shoes and dipped my feet in the cold water, shivering at the temperature but enjoying the sensation. I stayed there for a long time, feeling the isolation again, but also a sense of calm. It was easy to imagine living here, completely cut off from the world. I returned to the cabin in the late afternoon, the light already starting to dim. I made another fire and prepared a small dinner, feeling more confident about handling the stove and my supplies. Night fell quickly in the forest. Without city lights, the darkness felt heavy, almost physical. I checked all the locks on the cabin doors and windows, an unnecessary precaution perhaps, but one that gave me some comfort. I sat by the fire, listening to the wind in the trees, the occasional rustle of small animals outside. Everything seemed ordinary until a new sound reached my ears. A distant, irregular snapping of branches, coming from the woods beyond the clearing. At first, I thought it was just a deer or some other animal moving through the forest, but the snaps were deliberate, uneven, as if someone or something was moving carefully but intentionally. I froze, listening. The sound moved closer, stopping, then continuing again. My first instinct was to dismiss it, to tell myself the forest was alive with creatures. But there was a rhythm to the noises, a pattern that didn't fit with the random movement of animals. I checked the doors and windows again, confirming the locks. My heart was beating faster now, a tight, insistent rhythm in my chest. I grabbed a flashlight and peered out the window. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating nothing but trees and shadows. I walked around the outside of the cabin, shining the light into the forest. There was no one there, at least not that I could see, but the feeling of being watched was intense. I returned inside, my hands trembling slightly. I tried to stay calm, reminding myself that the forest was full of animals, and that my mind was playing tricks on me in the dark. I secured the firewood, made sure the stove was stable, and settled back into bed, keeping the flashlight nearby. That night was restless. Every small noise made me tense. Every shadow seemed to move with intent. I slept in short bursts, waking at intervals, listening. By the time morning came, I was exhausted but relieved to see sunlight filtering through the trees. I took a long walk around the clearing, trying to rationalize the previous night. I found footprints in the dirt near the cabin, human footprints, not animal. They were boot prints, large, with a tread I didn't recognize. They stopped at the edge of the forest and didn't continue into the clearing. My stomach sank. Someone had been close enough to the cabin to leave prints, but not close enough for me to see them the night before. I spent the day preparing for the worst. I checked my phone again. Still no signal. I reviewed my supplies, making sure I had enough food, water, and fuel for the stove. I made a plan in case I needed to leave quickly. Keys in hand, flashlight ready, shoes by the door. I stayed alert, constantly scanning the woods around the cabin. I noticed subtle signs that someone had been moving through the area over the past few days. Broken branches, flattened grass, disturbed rocks. The realization that I wasn't alone, that someone had been near the cabin without my knowledge, was terrifying, but I kept reminding myself that panic would not help. The next night, the snapping returned. Louder, closer, more deliberate. This time, I stayed calm but alert. I had reinforced the doors with a heavy chair, positioned myself near the window with the flashlight and a metal rod I found in the cabin. I watched as shadows shifted among the trees. Then, I saw movement. A figure, crouched, moving slowly from tree to tree. My heart raced, but I did not scream or make a sound. I observed, trying to gather information. The figure seemed to be a man, dressed in dark clothing, his movements cautious. He was clearly trying to remain unseen, watching the cabin. I realized that waiting passively might not be safe. I considered my options: escape or confrontation. Escape was risky. I would have to pass through the forest in the dark. Confrontation was equally risky, but staying put meant I could be trapped. I decided on a third approach. I would create a distraction. I filled a metal pan with rocks and threw it into the clearing, making a loud clatter. The figure froze, then disappeared into the darkness. I waited for what felt like hours, listening. No movement, no snapping. I assumed he had left. Morning brought cautious relief. I surveyed the area, confirming no signs of the intruder. I packed my things quickly, deciding not to spend another night in the cabin. I left some of my supplies behind, taking only what I could carry, and followed the trail back down the mountain. Every sound made me jump, the rustle of leaves, the distant snap of a branch, but I kept moving. After several hours, I reached the gravel road